Preface to the first, second, and third editions of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Preface to the third, second, and first editions. Whereas there was a space of 9 years between the first and second editions of this book, the need of a third edition was apparent when little more than a year had elapsed. I ought to be gratified by this change, but if I was unwilling previously to attribute the neglect of my work to its small value, I cannot take the interest which is now making its appearance as a proof of its quality. The advance of scientific knowledge has not left the interpretation of dreams untouched. When I wrote this book in 1899, there was as yet no sexual theory, and the analysis of the more complicated forms of psychoneurosis was still in its infancy. The interpretation of dreams was intended as an expedient to facilitate the psychological analysis of the neurosis. But since then, a profounder understanding of the neurosis has contributed towards the comprehension of the dream. The doctrine of dream interpretation itself has evolved in a direction which was insufficiently emphasized in the first edition of this book. From my own experience and the works of Stekel and other writers, I have since learned to appreciate more accurately the significance of symbolism in dreams, or rather in unconscious thought. In the course of years, a mass of data has accumulated which demands consideration. I have endeavored to deal with these innovations by interpolations in the text and footnotes. If these additions do not always quite adjust themselves to the framework of the treatise, or if the earlier text does not everywhere come up to the standard of our present knowledge, I must beg indulgence for this deficiency, since it is not only the result and indication of the increasingly rapid advance of our science. I will even venture to predict the directions in which further editions of this book, should there be a demand for them, may diverge from previous editions. Dream interpretation must seek a closer union with the rich material of poetry, myth, and popular idiom, and it must deal more faithfully than has hitherto been possible with the relations of dreams to the neurosis and to mental derangement. Her auto rank has afforded me valuable assistance in the selection of supplementary examples, and has revised the proofs of this edition. I have to thank him and many other colleagues for their contribution and corrections. Vienna, 1911. Preface to the second German edition. That there should have been a demand for a second edition of this book, a book which cannot be described as easy to read, before the completion of its first decade is not to be explained by the interest of the professional circles to which I was addressing myself. My psychiatric colleagues have not, apparently, attempted to look beyond the astonishment which may at first have been aroused by my novel conception of the dream, and the professional philosophers, who are anyhow accustomed to disposing of the dream in a few sentences, mostly the same, as a supplement to the states of consciousness, have evidently failed to realize that precisely in this connection it was possible to make all manner of deductions, such as must lead to a fundamental modification of our physiological doctrines. The attitude of the scientific reviewers was such to lead me to expect that the fate of the book would be to fall into oblivion, and the little flock of faithful adherents who follow my lead in the therapeutic application of psychoanalysis and interpret dreams by my method could not have exhausted the first edition of the book. I feel, therefore, that my thanks are due to the wider circle of cultured and inquiring readers whose sympathy has induced me, after the lapse of 9 years, once more to take up this difficult work, which has so many fundamental bearings. I am glad to be able to say that I found little in the book that called for alteration. Here and there I have interpolated fresh material, or have added opinions based on more extensive experience, or I have sought to elaborate individual points. But the essential passages treating of dreams and their interpretation and psychological doctrines to be deduced therefrom have been left unaltered. Subjectively, at all events, they have stood the test of time. Those who are acquainted with my other writings on the etiology and the mechanism of psychoneurosis will know that I never offer unfinished work as finished, and that I have endeavored to revise my conclusions in accordance with my maturing opinions, but as often hesitated, and I have often gone astray, and then it was always the interpretation of dreams that restored my self-confidence. My many scientific opponents are actuated by a wise instinct when they decline to follow me into the region of oneirology. Even the material of this book, even my own dreams, defaced by time or superseded, by means of which I have demonstrated the rules of dream interpretation, revealed, when I came to revise these pages, a continuity that revisited revision. For me, of course, this book has an additional subjective significance, which I did not understand until after its completion. It reveals itself to me as a piece of my self-analysis, as my reaction to the death of my father, that is, to the most important event, the most poignant loss in man's life. Once I had realized this, I felt that I could not obliterate the traces of this influence. But to my readers, the material from which they learn to evaluate and interpret dreams will be a matter of indifference. Where an inevitable comment could not be fitted into the old context, I have indicated by square brackets that it does not occur in the first edition. Berchtesgaden, 1908. Introductory note, first edition. In this volume, I have attempted to expound the methods and results of dream interpretation, and in so doing, I do not think I have overstepped the boundary of neuropathological science. For the dream proves on psychological investigation to be the first of a series of abnormal psychic formations, a series whose succeeding members, the hysterical phobias, the obsessions, the delusions, must, for practical reasons, claim the attention of the physician. The dream, as we shall see, has no title to such practical importance, but for that very reason its theoretical value as typical formation is all the greater, and the physician who cannot explain the origin of dream images will strive in vain to understand the phobias and the obsessive and delusional ideas, or to influence them by therapeutic methods. But the very context to which our subject owes its importance must be held responsible for the deficiencies of the following chapters. The abundant lacunae in this exposition represent so many points of contact, at which the problem of dream formation is linked up with the more comprehensive problem of psychopathology. Problems which cannot be treated in these pages, but which, if time and powers suffice, and if further material presents itself, may be elaborated elsewhere. The peculiar nature of the material employed to exemplify the interpretation of dreams has made the writing even of this treatise a difficult task. Consideration of the methods of dream interpretation will show why the dreams recorded in the literature on the subject, or those collected by persons unknown to me, were useless for my purpose. I had only the choice between my own dreams and those of the patients whom I was treating by psychoanalytic methods. But this later material was inadmissible, since the dream processes were undesirably complicated by the intervention of neurotic characters. And if I relate my own dreams, I must inevitably reveal to the gaze of strangers more of the intimacies of my psychic life than is agreeable to me, and more than seems fitting in a writer who is not a poet but a scientific investigator. To do so is painful, but unavoidable. I have submitted to the necessity, for otherwise I could not have demonstrated my physiological conclusions. Sometimes, of course, I could not resist the temptation to mitigate my indiscretions by omissions and substitutions. But wherever I have done so, the value of the examples cited have been very definitely diminished. I can only express the hope that my readers will understand my difficult position and will be indulgent, and further, that all persons who are in any way concerned in the dreams recorded will not seek to forbid our dream life at all events to exercise freedom of thought. End of preface to the third, second, and first editions.
Section 1 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. A. Brill. Section 1. The Scientific Literature of Dream Problems. In the following pages, I shall demonstrate that there is a psychological technique which makes it possible to interpret dreams, and that on the application of this technique, every dream will reveal itself as a psychological structure full of significance, and one which may be assigned to a specific place in the psychic activities of the waking state. Further, I shall endeavor to elucidate the processes which underlie the strangeness and obscurity of dreams, and to deduce from these processes the nature of the psychic forces whose conflict or cooperation is responsible for our dreams. This done, my investigation will terminate, as it will have reached the point where the problem of the dream merges into more comprehensive problems, and to solve these we must have recourse to material of a different kind. I shall begin by giving a short account of the views of earlier writers on this subject, and of the status of the dream problem in contemporary science, since in the course of this treatise I shall not often have occasion to refer to either. In spite of thousands of years of endeavor, little progress has been made in the scientific understanding of dreams. This fact has been so universally acknowledged by previous writers on the subject that it seems hardly necessary to quote individual opinions. The reader will find in the works listed at the end of this work many stimulating observations, and plenty of interesting material relating to our subject, but little or nothing that concerns the true nature of the dream, or that solves definitely any of its enigmas. The educated layman, of course, knows even less of the matter. The conception of the dream that was held in prehistoric ages by primitive peoples, and the influence which it may have exerted on the formation of their conceptions of the universe and of the soul, is a theme of great interest, that it is only with reluctance that I refrain from dealing with it in these pages. I will refer the reader to the well-known works of Sir John Lubbock, Herbert Spencer, E.B. Tylor, and other writers. I will only add that we shall not realize the importance of these problems and speculations until we have completed the task of dream interpretation that lies before us. A reminiscence of the concept of the dream that was held in primitive times seems to underlie the evaluation of the dream which was current among the peoples of classical antiquity. They took it for granted that dreams were related to the world of the supernatural beings in whom they believed, and that they brought inspirations from the gods and demons. Moreover, it appeared to them that dreams must serve a special purpose in respect of the dreamer, that, as a rule, they predicted the future. The extraordinary variations in the content of dreams and in the impressions which they produced on the dreamer made it, of course, very difficult to formulate a coherent conception of them, and necessitated manifold differentiations and group formations according to their value and reliability. The valuation of dreams by the individual philosophers of antiquity naturally depended on the importance which they were prepared to attribute to manticism in general. In the two works of Aristotle in which there is mention of dreams, they are already regarded as constituting a problem of psychology. We are told that the dream is not God-sent, that it is not of divine but of demonic origin, for nature is really demonic, not divine. That is to say, the dream is not a supernatural revelation, but is subject to the laws of the human spirit, which has, of course, a kinship with the divine. The dream is defined as the psychic activity of the sleeper, inasmuch as he is asleep. Aristotle was acquainted with some of the characteristics of the dream life. For example, he knew that a dream converts the slight sensations perceived in sleep into intense sensations. One imagines that one is walking through fire and feels hot, if this or that part of the body becomes only quite slightly warm, which led him to conclude that dreams might easily betray to the physician the first indications of an incipient physical change which escaped observation during the day. As has been said, those writers of antiquity who preceded Aristotle did not regard the dream as a product of the dreaming psyche, but as an inspiration of divine origin. And in ancient times, the two opposing tendencies, which we shall find throughout the ages in respect of the evaluation of the dream life, were already perceptible. The ancients distinguished between the true and valuable dreams, which were sent to the dreamer as warnings, or to foretell future events, and the vain, fraudulent, and empty dreams, whose object was to misguide him or lead him to destruction. Gruppe speaks of such a classification of dreams, citing Macrobius and Artemidorus. Dreams were divided into two classes. The first class was believed to be influenced only by the present or the past, and was unimportant in respect of the future. It included the anouknia, insomnia, which directly reproduce a given idea or its opposite, e.g. hunger or its satiation, and the phantasmata, which elaborate the given idea fantastically, as e.g. the nightmare, ephialtes. The second class of dreams, on the other hand, was determinative of the future. To this belonged 1. Direct prophecies received in the dream, chromatismos oraculum. 2. The foretelling of a future event, orama visio. 3. The symbolic dream, which requires interpretation, oneros somnium. This theory survived for many centuries. Connected with these varying estimations of the dream was the problem of dream interpretation. Dreams in general were expected to yield important solutions, but not every dream was immediately understood, and it was impossible to be sure that a certain incomprehensible dream did not really foretell something of importance, so that an effort was made to replace the incomprehensible content of the dream by something that should be at once comprehensible and significant. In later antiquity, Artemidorus of Daldis was regarded as the greatest authority on dream interpretation. His comprehensive works must serve to compensate us for the lost works of a similar nature. The pre-scientific conception of the dream which obtained among the ancients was, of course, in perfect keeping with their general conception of the universe, which was accustomed to project as an external reality that which possessed reality only in the life of the psyche. Further, it accounted for the main impression made upon the waking life by the morning memory of the dream. For in this memory, the dream, as compared with the rest of the psychic content, seems to be something alien, coming, as it were, from another world. It would be an error to suppose that theory of the supernatural origin of dreams lacks followers even in our own times, for quite apart from pietistic and mystical writers, who cling, as they are perfectly justified in doing, to the remnants of the once predominant realm of the supernatural until these remnants have been swept away by scientific explanation. We not infrequently find that quite intelligent persons, who in other respects are averse from anything of a romantic nature, go so far as to base their religious belief in the existence and cooperation of superhuman spiritual powers on the inexplicable nature of the phenomena of dreams. Hafner. The validity ascribed to the dream life by certain schools of philosophy, for example, by the school of Schelling, is a distinct reminiscence of the undisputed belief in the divinity of dreams which prevailed in antiquity. And for some thinkers, the mantic or prophetic power of dreams is still a subject of debate. This is due to the fact that the explanations attempted by psychology are too inadequate to cope with the accumulated material, however strongly the scientific thinker may feel that such superstitious doctrines should be repudiated. To write strongly the history of our scientific knowledge of the dream problem is extremely difficult, because, valuable though this knowledge may be in certain respects, no real progress in a definite direction is as yet discernible. No real foundation of verified results has hitherto been established on which future investigators might continue to build. Every new author approaches the same problems afresh and from the very beginning. If I were to enumerate such authors in chronological order, giving a survey of the opinions which each has held concerning the problems of the dream, I should be quite unable to draw a clear and complete picture of the present state of our knowledge on the subject. I have therefore preferred to base my method of treatment on themes rather than on authors, and in attempting the solution of each problem of the dream, I shall cite the material found in the literature of the subject. But as I have not yet succeeded in mastering the whole of this literature, for it is widely dispersed and interwoven with the literature of other subjects, I must ask my readers to rest content with my survey as it stands, provided that no fundamental fact or important point of view has been overlooked. Until recently, most authors have been inclined to deal with the subjects of sleep and dreams in conjunction, and together with these, they have commonly dealt with analogous conditions of a psychopathological nature and other dream-like phenomena, such as hallucinations, visions, etc. In recent works, on the other hand, there has been a tendency to keep more closely to the theme and to consider as a special subject the separate problems of the dream life. In this change, I should like to perceive an expression of the growing conviction that enlightenment and agreement in such obscure matters may be attained only by a series of detailed investigations. Such a detailed investigation, and one of a special psychological nature, is expounded in these pages. I have had little occasion to concern myself with the problem of sleep, as this is essentially a physiological problem, although the changes in the functional determination of the psychic apparatus should be included in a description of the sleeping state. The literature of sleep will therefore not be considered here. A scientific interest in the phenomena of dreams, as such, leads us to propound the following problems, which to a certain extent, interdependent, merge into one another. A. The relation of the dream to the waking state. The naive judgment of the dreamer on waking assumes that the dream, even if it does not come from another world, has at all events transported the dreamer into another world. The old physiologist, Burdock, to whom we are indebted for a careful and discriminating description of the phenomena of dreams, expressed this conviction in a frequently quoted passage. The waking life, with its trials and joys, its pleasures and pains, is never repeated. On the contrary, the dream aims at relieving us of these. Even when our whole mind is filled with one subject, when our hearts are rent by bitter grief, or when some task has been taxing our mental capacity to the utmost, the dream either gives us something entirely alien, or it selects for its combinations only a few elements of reality, or it merely enters into the key of our mood and symbolizes reality. J.H. Fichte speaks in precisely the same sense of supplementary dreams, calling them one of the secret self-healing benefits of the psyche. L. Strumpel expresses himself to the same effect in his Natur and Entstehung der Traum, a study which is deservedly held in high esteem. He who dreams turns his back upon the world of waking consciousness. In the dream, the memory of the orderly content of waking consciousness and its normal behavior is almost entirely lost. The almost complete and unencumbered isolation of the psyche in the dream from the regular normal content and course of the waking state. Yet the overwhelming majority of writers on the subject have adopted the contrary view of the relation of the dream to waking life. Thus, Hafner says, to begin with, the dream continues the waking life. Our dreams always connect themselves with such ideas as have shortly before been present in our consciousness. Careful examination will nearly always detect a thread by which the dream has linked itself to the experiences of the previous day. Weygand flatly contradicts the statement of Burdock. For it may often be observed, apparently indeed in the great majority of dreams, that they lead us directly back into everyday life instead of releasing us from it. Maury expresses the same idea in a concise formula. Nous rêvons de ce que nous avons vu, dit, désiré ou fait. We dream of what we have seen, said, desired, or done. Jessen, in his Psychologie, published in 1855, is rather more explicit. The content of dreams is always more or less determined by the personality, the age, sex, station in life, education and habits, and by the events and experiences of the whole past life of the individual. The philosopher I.G.E. Maas adopts the most unequivocal attitude in respect of this question. Experience corroborates our assertion that we dream most frequently of those things toward which our warmest passions are directed. This shows us that our passions must influence the generation of our dreams. The ambitious man dreams of the laurels which he has won, perhaps only in imagination, or has still to win, while the lover occupies himself in his dreams with the object of his dearest hopes. All the sensual desires and loathings which slumber in the heart, if they are stimulated by any cause, may combine with other ideas and give rise to a dream, or these ideas may mingle in an already existing dream. The ancients entertained the same idea concerning the dependence of the dream content on life. I will quote Radishtak. When Xerxes, before his expedition against Greece, was dissuaded from his resolution by good counsel, but was again and again incited by dreams to undertake it, one of the old rational dream interpreters of the Persians, Artabanus, told him, and very appropriately, that dream images for the most part contain that of which one has been thinking in the waking state. In the didactic poem of Lucretius on the nature of things, there occurs this passage: "And whatever be the pursuit to which one clings with devotion, whatever the things on which we have been occupied much in the past, the mind being thus more intent upon that pursuit, it is generally the same things that we seem to encounter in dreams, pleaders to plead their cause and collate laws, generals to contend and engage battle." The contradiction between these two views concerning the relation between dream life and waking life seems indeed irresolvable. Here we may usefully cite the opinion of F. W. Hildebrandt, 1875, who held that on the whole the peculiarities of the dream can only be described as a series of contrasts which apparently amount to contradictions. The first of these contrasts is formed by the strict isolation or seclusion of the dream from true and actual life on the one hand, and on the other hand by the continuous encroachment of the one upon the other, and the constant dependence of the one upon the other. The dream is something absolutely divorced from the reality experienced during the waking state. One may call it an existence hermetically sealed up and insulated from real life by an unbridgeable chasm. It frees us from reality, blots out the normal recollection of reality, and sets us in another world and a totally different life, which fundamentally has nothing in common with real life. Hildebrandt then asserts that in falling asleep our whole being with its forms of existence disappears, as through an invisible trap-door. In one's dream, one is perhaps making a voyage to St. Helena in order to offer the imprisoned Napoleon an exquisite vintage of Moselle. One is most affably received by the ex-emperor, and one feels almost sorry when, on waking, the interesting illusion is destroyed. But let us now compare the situation existing in the dream with the actual reality. The dreamer has never been a wine merchant, and has no desire to become one. He has never made a sea voyage, and St. Helena is the last place in the world that he would choose as the destination of such a voyage. The dreamer feels no sympathy for Napoleon, but on the contrary, a strong patriotic aversion. And lastly, the dreamer was not yet among the living when Napoleon died on the island of St. Helena, so that it was beyond the realms of possibility that he should have had any personal relations with Napoleon. The dream experience thus appears as something entirely foreign, interpolated between two mutually related and successive periods of time. Nevertheless, continues Hildebrandt, the apparent contrary is just as true and correct. I believe that side by side with this seclusion and insulation there may still exist the most intimate interrelation. We may therefore justly say, whatever the dream may offer us, it derives its material from reality, and from the psychic life centered upon this reality. However extraordinary the dream may seem, it can never detach itself from the real world, and its most sublime, as well as its most ridiculous constructions, must always borrow their elementary material either from that which our eyes have beheld in the outer world, or from that which has already found a place somewhere in our waking thoughts. In other words, it must be taken from that which we have already experienced, either objectively or subjectively. End of section 1. Recording by Alicia in Philadelphia.
Section 2 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Judith Parker. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 2. The material of dreams, memory in dreams. That all the material composing the content of a dream is somehow derived from experience, that it is reproduced or remembered in the dream. This, at least, may be accepted as an incontestable fact. Yet it would be wrong to assume that such a connection between the dream content and reality will be easily obvious from a comparison between the two. On the contrary, the connection must be carefully sought, and in quite a number of cases it may for a long while elude discovery. The reason for this is to be found in a number of peculiarities evinced by the faculty of memory in dreams, which peculiarities, though generally observed, have hitherto defied explanation. It will be worth our while to examine these characteristics exhaustively. To begin with, it happens that certain material appears in the dream content which cannot be subsequently recognized in the waking state as being part of one's knowledge and experience. One remembers clearly enough having dreamed of the thing in question, but one cannot recall the actual experience or the time of its occurrence. The dreamer is therefore in the dark as to the source which the dream has tapped, and is even tempted to believe in an independent productive activity on the part of the dream, until, often long afterwards, a fresh episode restores the memory of that former experience, which had been given up for lost, and so reveals the source of the dream. One is therefore forced to admit that in the dream something was known and remembered that cannot be remembered in the waking state. Delboeuf relates from his own experience an especially impressive example of this kind. He saw in his dream the courtyard of his house covered with snow, and found there 2 little lizards, half frozen and buried in the snow. Being a lover of animals, he picked them up, warmed them, and put them back into the hole in the wall which was reserved especially for them. He also gave them a few fronds of a little fern which was growing on the wall, and of which he knew they were very fond. In the dream he knew the name of the plant, Asplenium ruta muralis. The dream continued, returning after a digression to the lizards, and to his astonishment Delboeuf saw 2 other little lizards falling upon what was left of the ferns. On turning his eyes to the open fields, he saw a 5th and 6th lizard, making for the hole in the wall, and finally the whole road was covered by a procession of lizards, all wandering in the same direction. In his waking state, Delboeuf knew only a few Latin names of plants, and nothing of any Asplenium. To his great surprise, he discovered that a fern of this name did actually exist, and that the correct name was Asplenium ruta muraria, which the dream had slightly distorted. An accidental coincidence was, of course, inconceivable, yet where he got his knowledge of the name Asplenium in the dream remained a mystery to him. The dream occurred in 1862. 16 years later, while at the house of one of his friends, the philosopher noticed a small album containing dried plants, such as are sold as souvenirs to visitors in many parts of Switzerland. A sudden recollection came to him. He opened the herbarium, discovered therein the Asplenium of his dream, and recognized his own handwriting in the accompanying Latin name. The connection could now be traced. In 1860, 2 years before the date of the lizard dream, one of his friend's sisters, while on her wedding journey, had paid a visit to Delboeuf. She had with her at the time this very album, which was intended for her brother, and Delboeuf had taken the trouble to write, at the dictation of a botanist, the Latin name under each of the dried plants. The same good fortune which gave this example its unusual value enabled Delboeuf to trace yet another portion of this dream to its forgotten source. One day in 1877, he came upon an old volume of an illustrated periodical, in which he found the whole procession of lizards pictured just as he had dreamt of it in 1862. The volume bore the date 1861, and Delboeuf remembered that he had subscribed to the journal since its first appearance. That dreams have at their disposal recollections which are inaccessible to the waking state is such a remarkable and theoretically important fact that I should like to draw attention to the point by recording yet another hypermnesic dream. Maury relates that for some time the word Musadan used to occur to him during the day. He knew it to be the name of a French city, but that was all. One night he dreamed of a conversation with a certain person who told him that she came from Musadan, and in answer to his question as to where the city was, she replied, "Musadan is the principal town of a district in the department of Dordogne." On waking, Maury gave no credence to the information received in his dream, but the gazetteer showed it to be perfectly correct. In this case, the superior knowledge of the dreamer was confirmed, but it was not possible to trace the forgotten source of this knowledge. Jessen, in parentheses, page 55, refers to a very similar incident, the period of which is more remote. Quote, "Among others, we may here mention the dream of the elder Scaliger," in parentheses, Hennings, page 300, end parentheses, who wrote a poem in praise of the famous men of Verona, and to whom a man named Brugnollus appeared in a dream, complaining that he had been neglected. Though Scaliger could not remember that he had heard of the man, he wrote some verses in his honor, and his son learned subsequently that a certain Brugnollus had at one time been famed in Verona as a critic. End quote. A hypermnesic dream, especially remarkable for the fact that a memory not at first recalled was afterwards recognized in a dream which followed the first, is narrated by the Marquis de Hervé de Saint-Denis. Quote, "I once dreamed of a young woman with fair golden hair, whom I saw chatting with my sister as she showed her a piece of embroidery. In my dream she seemed familiar to me. I thought, indeed, that I had seen her repeatedly. After waking, her face was still quite vividly before me, but I was absolutely unable to recognize it. I fell asleep again. The dream picture repeated itself. In this new dream I addressed the golden-haired lady and asked her whether I had not had the pleasure of meeting her somewhere. 'Of course,' she replied. 'Don't you remember the bathing place at Pornic?' Thereupon I awoke, and I was then able to recall with certainty and in detail the incidents with which this charming dream face was connected." End quote. I believe that Myers has published a whole collection of such hypermnesic dreams in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, but these, unfortunately, are inaccessible to me. I think everyone who occupies himself with dreams will recognize, as a very common phenomenon, the fact that a dream will give proof of the knowledge and recollection of matters of which the dreamer, in his waking state, did not imagine himself to be cognizant. In my analytic investigations of nervous patients, of which I shall speak later, I find that it happens many times every week that I am able to convince them from their dreams that they are perfectly well acquainted with quotations, obscene expressions, etc., and make use of them in their dreams, although they have forgotten them in their waking state. I shall here cite an innocent example of dream hypermnesia, because it was easy to trace the source of the knowledge which was accessible only in the dream. A patient dreamed, amongst other things, in a rather long dream, that he ordered a kontuzauka in a cafe, and after telling me this, he asked me what it could be, as he had never heard the name before. I was able to tell him that kontuzauka was a Polish liqueur, which he could not have invented in his dream, as the name had long been familiar to me from the advertisements. At first the patient would not believe me, but some days later, after he had allowed his dream of the cafe to become a reality, he noticed the name on a signboard at a street corner, which for some months he had been passing at least twice a day. I have learned from my own dreams how largely the discovery of the origin of individual dream elements may be dependent on chance. Thus, for some years before I had thought of writing this book, I was haunted by the picture of a church tower of fairly simple construction, which I could not remember ever having seen. I then suddenly recognized it with absolute certainty at a small station between Salzburg and Reichenhall. This was in the late 90s, and the first time I had traveled over this route was in 1886. In later years, when I was already busily engaged in the study of dreams, I was quite annoyed by the frequent recurrence of the dream image of a certain peculiar locality. I saw in definite orientation to my own person, on my left, a dark space in which a number of grotesque sandstone figures stood out. A glimmering recollection, which I did not quite believe, told me that it was the entrance to a beer cellar. But I could explain neither the meaning nor the origin of this dream picture. In 1907, I happened to go to Padua, which, to my regret, I had been unable to visit since 1895. My first visit to this beautiful university city had been unsatisfactory. I had been unable to see Giotto's frescoes in the church of the Madonna dell'Arena. I set out for the church, but turned back on being informed that it was closed for the day. On my second visit, 12 years later, I thought I would compensate myself for this disappointment, and before doing anything else, I set out for Madonna dell'Arena. In the street leading to it on my left, probably at the spot where I had turned back in 1895, I discovered the place with its sandstone figures which I had so often seen in my dream. It was, in fact, the entrance to a restaurant garden. One of the sources from which dreams draw material for reproduction, material of which some part is not recalled or utilized in our waking thoughts, is to be found in childhood. Here I will cite only a few of the authors who have observed and emphasized this fact. Hildebrandt, parentheses, page 23, quote, "It has already been expressly admitted that a dream sometimes brings back to the mind, with a wonderful power of reproduction, remote and even forgotten experiences from the earliest periods of one's life." Strumpel, parentheses, page 40, quote, "The subject becomes more interesting still when we remember how the dream sometimes drags out, as it were, from the deepest and densest psychic deposits which later years have piled upon the earliest experiences of childhood, the pictures of certain persons, places, and things quite intact and in all their original freshness. This is confined not merely to such impressions as were vividly perceived at the time of their occurrence, or were associated with intense psychological values, to recur later in the dream as actual reminiscences which give pleasure to the waking mind. On the contrary, the depths of the dream memory rather contain such images of persons, places, things, and early experiences as either possessed but little consciousness and no psychic value whatsoever, or have long since lost both, and therefore appear totally strange and unknown, both in the dream and in the waking state, until their early origin is revealed. End quote. Volkite says, quote, "It is especially to be remarked how readily infantile and youthful reminiscences enter into our dreams. What we have long ceased to think about, what has long since lost all importance for us, is constantly recalled by the dream." End quote. The control which the dream exercises over material from our childhood, most of which, as is well known, falls into the lacunae of our conscious memory, is responsible for the production of interesting hypermnesic dreams, of which I shall cite a few more examples. Maury relates, in parentheses, page 92, that as a child he often went from his native city, Meaux, to the neighboring Trillport, where his father was superintending the construction of a bridge. One night a dream transported him to Trillport, and he was once more playing in the streets there. A man approached him wearing a sort of uniform. Maury asked him his name, and he introduced himself, saying that his name was C, and that he was a bridge guard. On waking, Maury, who still doubted the actuality of the reminiscence, asked his old servant, who had been with him in his childhood, whether she remembered a man of this name. "Of course," was the reply. "He used to be the watchman on the bridge which your father was building then." End quote. Maury records another example which demonstrates no less clearly the reliability of the reminiscences of childhood that emerge in our dreams. M.F., who as a child had lived in Montbrison, decided after an absence of 25 years to visit his home and the old friends of his family. The night before his departure he dreamt that he had reached his destination, and that near Montbrison he met a man whom he did not know by sight, and who told him that he was M.F., a friend of his father's. The dreamer remembered that as a child he had known a gentleman of this name, but on waking he could no longer recall his features. Several days later, having actually arrived at Montbrison, he found once more the locality of his dream, which he had thought was unknown to him, and there he met a man whom he at once recognized as the M.F. of his dream, with only this difference, that the real person was very much older than his dream image. Here I might relate one of my own dreams, in which the recalled impression takes the form of an association. In my dream I saw a man whom I recognized, while dreaming, as the doctor of my native town. His face was not distinct, but his features were blended with those of one of my schoolmasters, whom I still meet from time to time. What association there was between the two persons I could not discover on waking, but upon questioning my mother concerning the doctor, I learned that he was a one-eyed man. The schoolmaster, whose image in my dream obscured that of the physician, had also only one eye. I had not seen the doctor for 38 years, and as far as I know, I had never thought of him in my waking state, although a scar on my chin might have reminded me of his professional attentions. As though to counterbalance the excessive part which is played in our dreams by the impressions of childhood, many authors assert that the majority of dreams reveal elements drawn from our most recent experiences. Robert even declares that the normal dream generally occupies itself only with the impressions of the last few days. We shall find, indeed, that the theory of the dream advanced by Robert absolutely requires that our oldest impressions should be thrust into the background and our most recent ones brought to the fore. However, the fact here stated by Robert is correct. This I can confirm from my own investigations. Nelson, an American author, holds that the impressions received in a dream most frequently date from the second day before the dream, or from the third day before it, as though the impressions of the day immediately preceding the dream were not sufficiently weakened and remote. Many authors who are unwilling to question the intimate connection between the dream content and the waking state have been struck by the fact that the impressions which have intensely occupied the waking mind appear in dreams only after they have been, to some extent, removed from the mental activities of the day. Thus, as a rule, we do not dream of a beloved person who is dead while we are still overwhelmed with sorrow, in parentheses, delage. Yet Miss Hallam, one of the most recent observers, has collected examples which reveal the very opposite behavior in this respect, and upholds the claims of psychological individuality in this matter. The third most remarkable, and at the same time most incomprehensible, peculiarity of memory in dreams is shown in the selection of the material reproduced, for here it is not, as in the waking state, only the most significant things that are held to be worth remembering, but also the most indifferent and insignificant details. In this connection, I will quote those authors who have expressed their surprise in the most emphatic language. Hildebrandt is of the opinion, quote, "For it is a remarkable fact that dreams do not, as a rule, take their elements from important and far-reaching events, or from the intense and urgent interests of the preceding day, but from unimportant incidents from the worthless odds and ends of recent experience or of the remoter past. The most shocking death in our family, the impressions of which keep us awake long into the night, is obliterated from our memories until the first moment of waking brings it back to us with distressing force. On the other hand, the wart on the forehead of a passing stranger, to whom we did not give a moment's thought once he was out of sight, finds a place in our dreams." End quote. Strumpel speaks of, quote, "cases in which the analysis of a dream brings to light elements which, although derived from the experiences of yesterday or the day before yesterday, were yet so unimportant and worthless for the waking state that they were forgotten soon after they were experienced. Some experiences may be the chance-heard remarks of other persons, or their superficially observed actions, or fleeting perceptions of things or persons, or isolated phrases that we have read, etc." End quote. Havelock Ellis opines, quote, "The profound emotions of waking life, the questions and problems on which we spend our chief voluntary mental energy, are not those which usually present themselves at once to dream consciousness. It is, so far as the immediate past is concerned, mostly the trifling, the incidental, the forgotten impressions of daily life which reappear in our dreams. The psychic activities that are awake most intensely are those that sleep most profoundly." End quote. It is precisely in connection with these characteristics of memory and dreams that Binns, parentheses, page 45, finds occasion to express dissatisfaction with the explanations of dreams which he himself had favored. Quote, "And the normal dream raises similar questions. Why do we not always dream of mental impressions of the day before, instead of going back without any perceptible reason to the almost forgotten past now lying far behind us? why in a dream does consciousness so often revive the impression of indifferent memory pictures, while the cerebral cells that bear the most sensitive records of experience remain for the most part inert and numb, unless an acute revival during the waking state has quite recently excited them." End quote. We can readily understand how the strange preference shown by the dream memory for the indifferent and therefore disregarded details of daily experience must commonly lead us altogether to overlook the dependence of dreams on the waking state, or must at least make it difficult for us to prove this dependence in any individual case. Thus it happened that in the statistical treatment of her own and her friend's dream, Miss Whitten Calkins found that 11% of the entire number showed no relation to the waking state. Hildebrandt was certainly correct in his assertion that all our dream images could be genetically explained if we devoted enough time and material to the tracing of their origin. To be sure, he calls this a most tedious and thankless job, for most often it would lead us to ferret out all sorts of psychically worthless things from the remotest corners of our storehouse of memories, and to bring to light all sorts of quite indifferent events of long ago, from the oblivion which may have overtaken them an hour after their occurrence. I must, however, express my regret that this discerning author refrained from following the path which at first sight seems so unpromising, for it would have led him directly to the central point of the explanation of dreams. The behavior of memory in dreams is surely most significant for any theory of memory whatsoever. It teaches us that, quote, "Nothing which we have once psychically possessed is ever entirely lost," end quote. Parentheses, Schultz, page 34. Or, as Delboeuf puts it, quote, "Any impression, no matter how insignificant, leaves an inalterable trace, indefinitely susceptible to reappear during the day." End quote. A conclusion to which we are urged by so many other pathological manifestations of mental life. Let us bear in mind this extraordinary capacity of the memory in dreams in order the more keenly to realize the contradiction which has to be put forward in certain dream theories to be mentioned later, which seek to explain the absurdities and incoherences of dreams by a partial forgetting of what we have known during the day. It might even occur to one to reduce the phenomenon of dreaming to that of remembering, and to regard the dream as the manifestation of a reproductive activity, unresting even at night, which is an end in itself. This would seem to be in agreement with statements such as those made by Pilz, according to which definite relations between the time of dreaming and the contents of a dream may be demonstrated, inasmuch as the impressions reproduced by the dream in deep sleep belong to the remote past, while those reproduced towards morning are of recent origin. But such a conception is rendered improbable from the outset by the manner in which the dream deals with the material to be remembered. Strumpel rightly calls our attention to the fact that repetitions of experiences do not occur in dreams. It is true that a dream will make a beginning in that direction, but the next link is wanting. It appears in a different form or is replaced by something entirely novel. The dream gives us only fragmentary reproductions. This is so far the rule that it permits of a theoretical generalization. Still, there are exceptions in which an episode is repeated in a dream as completely as it can be reproduced by our waking memory. Delboeuf relates of one of his university colleagues that a dream of his repeated in all its details a perilous drive in which he escaped accident as if by miracle. Miss Calkins mentions 2 dreams, the contents of which exactly reproduced an experience of the previous day. And in a later chapter I shall have occasion to give an example that came to my knowledge of a childish experience which recurred unchanged in a dream. End of section 2. Recording by Judith Parker, drjudithparker.com.
Section 3 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 3. Dream Stimuli and Sources. What is meant by dream stimuli and dream sources may be explained by a reference to the popular saying, dreams come from the stomach. This notion covers a theory which conceives a dream as resulting from a disturbance of sleep. We should not have dreamed if some disturbing element had not come into play during our sleep, and the dream is a reaction against this disturbance. The discussion of the exciting causes of dreams occupies a great deal of space in the literature of dreams. It is obvious that this problem could have made its appearance only after dreams had become an object of biological investigation. The ancients, who conceived of dreams as divine inspirations, had no need to look for stimuli. For them, a dream was due to the will of divine or demonic powers, and its content was the product of their special knowledge and intention. Science, however, immediately raised the question whether the stimuli of dreams were single or multiple, and this in turn led to the consideration whether the causal explanation of dreams belonged to the region of psychology or to that of physiology. Most authors appear to assume that disturbance of sleep, and hence dreams, may arise from various causes, and that physical as well as mental stimuli may play the part of dream excitants. Opinions differ widely in preferring this or the other factor as the cause of dreams, and in classifying them in order of importance. Whenever the sources of dreams are completely enumerated, they fall into the following 4 categories which have been employed in the classification of dreams. 1. External objective sensory stimuli. 2. Internal subjective sensory stimuli. 3. Internal organic physical stimuli. 4. Purely psychical sources of excitation. External sensory stimuli. The younger Strumpel, the son of a philosopher whose work on dreams has already more than once served us as a guide in considering the problems of dreams, has, as is well known, recorded his observations of a patient afflicted with general anesthesia of the skin and with paralysis of several of the higher sensory organs. This man would lapse into sleep whenever the few remaining sensory paths between him and the outer world were closed. When we wish to fall asleep, we are accustomed to strive for a condition similar to that obtaining in Strumpel's experiment. We close the most important sensory portals, the eyes, and we endeavor to protect the other senses from all stimuli or from any change of the stimuli already acting upon them. We then fall asleep, although our preparations are never wholly successful, for we can never completely insulate the sensory organs, nor can we entirely abolish the excitability of the sensory organs themselves. That we may at any time be awakened by intenser stimuli should prove to us that the mind has remained in constant communication with the external world even during sleep. The sensory stimuli that reach us during sleep may easily become the source of dreams. There are a great many stimuli of this nature, ranging from those unavoidable stimuli which are proper to the state of sleep or occasionally admitted by it, to those fortuitous stimuli which are calculated to wake the sleeper. Thus, a strong light may fall upon the eyes, a noise may be heard, or an odor may irritate the mucous membranes of the nose. In our unintentional movements during sleep, We may lay bare parts of the body and thus expose them to a sensation of cold, or by a change of position we may excite sensations of pressure and touch. A mosquito may bite us, or a slight nocturnal mischance may simultaneously attack more than one sense organ. Observers have called attention to a whole series of dreams in which the stimulus ascertained on waking and some part of the dream content corresponded to such a degree that the stimulus could be recognized as the source of the dream. I shall here cite a number of such dreams, collected by Jessen, which are traceable to more or less accidental objective sensory stimuli. Every noise indistinctly perceived gives rise to corresponding dream representations. The rolling of thunder takes us into the thick of battle. The crowing of a cock may be transferred into human shrieks of terror, and the creaking of a door may conjure up dreams of burglars breaking into the house. When one of our blankets slips off of us at night, we may dream that we are walking about naked or falling into water. If we lie diagonally across the bed with our feet extending beyond the edge, we may dream of standing on the brink of a terrifying precipice or of falling from a great height. Should our head accidentally get under the pillow, we may imagine a huge rock overhanging us and about to crush us under its weight. An accumulation of semen produces voluptuous dreams, and local pains give rise to ideas of suffering ill treatment, of hostile attacks, or of accidental bodily injuries. Mayer once dreamed of being attacked by several men who threw him flat on the ground and drove a stake into the earth between his first and second toes. While imagining this in his dream, he suddenly awoke and felt a piece of straw sticking between his toes. The same author, according to Hemmings, dreamed on another occasion when his nightshirt was rather too tight around his neck that he was being hanged. In his youth, Hofbauer dreamed of having fallen from a high wall and found on waking that the bedstead had come apart and that he had actually fallen onto the floor. Gregory relates that he once applied a hot water bottle to his feet and dreamed of taking a trip to the summit of Mount Etna, where he found the heat of the soil almost unbearable. After having a blister applied to his head, another man dreamed of being scalped by Indians. Still another, whose shirt was damp, dreamed that he was dragged through a stream. An attack of gout caused the patient to believe that he was in the hands of the Inquisition and suffering the pains of torture. The argument that there is a resemblance between the dream stimulus and the dream content would be confirmed if by a systematic induction of stimuli we should succeed in producing dreams corresponding to these stimuli. According to Macnish, such experiments had already been made by Jerome de Bussering. He left his knee exposed and dreamed of traveling on a mail coach by night. He remarked in this connection that travelers were well aware how cold the knees became in a coach at night. On another occasion, he left the back of his head uncovered and dreamed that he was taking part in a religious ceremony in the open air. In the country where he lived, it was customary to keep the head always covered except on occasions of this kind. Maury reports fresh observation on self-induced dreams of his own. A number of other experiments were unsuccessful. He was tickled with a feather on his lips and on the tip of his nose. He dreamed of an awful torture, that a mask of pitch was stuck to his face and then forcibly torn off, bringing the skin with it. Scissors were whetted against a pair of tweezers. He heard bells ringing, then sounds of tumult, which took him back to the days of the Revolution of 1848. Cologne was held to his nostrils. He found himself in Cairo, in the shop of Johann Maria Farina. This was followed by fantastic adventures which he was not able to recall. His neck was slightly pinched. He dreamed that a blister was being applied and thought of a doctor who had treated him in childhood. A hot iron was brought near his face. He dreamed that chauffeurs had broken into the house and were forcing the occupants to give up their money by thrusting their feet into braziers. The Duchess de Abrantes, whose secretary he imagined himself to be then, entered the room. A drop of water was allowed to fall on his forehead. He imagined himself in Italy, perspiring heavily and drinking the white wine of Orvieto. When the light of a candle screened with red paper was allowed to fall on his face, he dreamed of thunder, of heat, and of a storm at sea which he once witnessed in the English Channel. Hervey, Weygand, and others have made attempts to produce dreams experimentally. Many have observed the striking skill of the dream in interweaving into its structure sudden impressions from the outer world, in such a manner as to represent a gradually approaching catastrophe. In former years, this author relates, I occasionally made use of an alarm clock in order to wake punctually at a certain hour in the morning. It probably happened hundreds of times that the sound of this instrument fitted into an apparently very long and connected dream, as though the entire dream had been especially designed for it, as though it found in this sound its appropriate and logically indispensable climax, its inevitable denouement. I shall presently have occasion to cite 3 of these alarm clock dreams in a different connection. Wilhelm relates, a composer once dreamed that he was teaching a class and was just explaining something to his pupils. When he had finished, he turned to one of the boys with the question, "Did you understand me?" The boy cried out like one possessed, "Oh, yeah." Annoyed by this, he reprimanded his pupil for shouting. But now the entire class was screaming, "Orya!" then "Oryo!" and finally "Fuerio!" He was then aroused by the actual fire alarm in the street. Garnier, on the authority of Radestock, relates that Napoleon I, while sleeping in a carriage, was awakened from a dream by an explosion which took him back to the crossing of the Tagliamento and the bombardment of the Austrians, so that he started up crying, "We have been undermined." The following dream of Maury's has become celebrated. He was ill in bed. His mother was sitting beside him. He dreamed of the reign of terror during the Revolution. He witnessed some terrible scenes of murder, and finally he himself was summoned before the tribunal. There he saw Robespierre, Marat, Fouquier-Tinville, and all the sorry heroes of those terrible days. He had to give an account of himself, and after all manner of incidents which did not fix themselves in his memory, he was sentenced to death. Accompanied by an enormous crowd, he was led to the place of execution. He mounted a scaffold, the executioner tied him to the plank, it tipped over, and the knife of the guillotine fell. He felt his head severed from his trunk, and awakened in terrible anxiety, only to find that the headboard of the bed had fallen and had actually struck the cervical vertebrae just where the knife of the guillotine would have fallen. This dream gave rise to an interesting discussion initiated by Lalerain and Egger in the Revue Philosophique as to whether and how it was possible for the dreamer to crowd together an amount of dream content apparently so large in the short space of time elapsing between the perception of the waking stimulus and the moment of actual waking. Examples of this nature show that objective stimuli occurring in sleep are among the most firmly established of all the sources of dreams. They are indeed the only stimuli of which the layman knows anything whatever. If we ask an educated person who is not familiar with the literature of dreams how dreams originate, he is certain to reply by a reference to a case known to him in which a dream has been explained after waking by a recognized objective stimulus. Science, however, cannot stop here, but is incited to further investigation by the observation that the stimulus influencing the senses during sleep does not appear in the dream at all in its true form, but is replaced by some other representation, which is in some way related to it. But the relation existing between the stimulus and the resulting dream is, according to Maury, a sort of relation which is, however, neither unique nor exclusive. If we read, for example, 3 of Hildbrandt's alarm clock dreams, we shall be compelled to ask why the same casual stimulus evoked so many different results, and why just these results and no others. I am taking a walk on a beautiful spring morning. I stroll through the green meadows to a neighboring village, where I see numbers of the inhabitants going to church, wearing their best clothes and carrying their hymn books under their arms. I remember that it is a Sunday, and that the morning service will soon begin. I decide to attend it, but as I am rather overheated, I think I will wait in the churchyard until I am cooler. While reading the various epitaphs, I hear the sexton climbing the church tower, and I see above me the small bell which is about to ring for the beginning of service. For a little while it hangs motionless, then it begins to swing, and suddenly its notes resound so clearly and penetratingly that my sleep comes to an end. But the notes of the bell come from the alarm clock. A second combination. It is a bright winter day. The streets are deep in snow. I have promised to go on a sleigh ride, but I have to wait some time before I am told that the sleigh is at the door. Now I am preparing to get into the sleigh. I put on my furs, my foot warmer is put in, and at last I have taken my seat. But still my departure is delayed. At last the reins are twitched, the horses start, and the sleigh bells, now violently shaken, strike up their familiar music with a force that instantly tears the gossamer of my dream. Again, it is only the shrill note of my alarm clock. Yet a third example. I see the kitchen maid walking along the passage to the dining room with a pile of several dozen plates. The porcelain column in her arms seems to me to be in danger of losing its equilibrium. "Take care," I exclaim, "you will drop the whole pile." The usual retort is naturally made that she is used to such things. Meanwhile, I continue to follow her with my anxious gaze, and behold, at the threshold the fragile plates fall and crash and roll across the floor in hundreds of pieces. But soon I perceive that the endless din is not really a rattling, but a true ringing, and with this ringing the dreamer now becomes aware that the alarm clock has done its duty. The question why the dreaming mind misjudges the nature of the objective sensory stimulus has been answered by Strumpel, and in an almost identical fashion by Wundt. Their explanation is that the reaction of the mind to the stimulus attacking sleep is complicated and confused by the formation of illusions. A sensory impression is recognized by us and correctly interpreted. That is, it is classed with the memory group to which it belongs according to all previous experience, if the impression is strong, clear, and sufficiently prolonged, and if we have sufficient time to submit it to those mental processes. But if these conditions are not fulfilled, we mistake the object which gives rise to the impression, and on the basis of this impression we construct an illusion. If one takes a walk in an open field and perceives indistinctly a distant object, it may happen that one will first take it for a horse. On closer inspection, the image of a cow resting may obtrude itself, and the picture may finally resolve itself with certainty into a group of people sitting on the ground. The impressions which the mind receives during sleep from external stimuli are of a similarly indistinct nature. They give rise to illusions because the impression evokes a greater or lesser number of memory images through which it acquires its psychic value. As for the question in which of the many possible spheres of memory the corresponding images are aroused, and which of the possible associative connections are brought into play, that, to quote Strumpel again, is indeterminable, and is left, as it were, to the caprices of the mind. Here we may take our choice. We may admit that the laws of dream formation cannot really be traced any further, and so refrain from asking whether or not the interpretation of the illusion evoked by sensory impression depends upon still other conditions, or we may assume that the objective sensory stimulus encroaching upon sleep plays only a modest role as a dream source, and that other factors determine the choice of the memory image to be evoked. Indeed, on carefully examining Mari's experimentally produced dreams, which I have purposely cited in detail, one is inclined to object that his investigations trace the origin of only one element of the dreams, and that the rest of the dream content seems too independent and too full of detail to be explained by a single requirement, namely, that it must correspond with the element experimentally introduced. Indeed, one even begins to doubt the illusion theory and the power of objective impressions to shape the dream when one realizes that such impressions are sometimes subjected to the most peculiar and far-fetched interpretations in our dreams. Thus, M. Simon tells of a dream in which he saw a persons of gigantic stature seated at a table and heard distinctly the horrible clattering produced by the impact of their jaws as they chewed their food. On waking, he heard the clatter of a horse's hooves as it galloped past his window. In this case, the sound of a horse's hooves had revived ideas from the memory sphere of Gulliver's Travels, the sojourn with the giants of Brobdingnag, and the virtuous horse-like creatures, as I should perhaps interpret the dream without any assistance on the author's part. Ought not the choice of a memory sphere so alien to the stimulus to be further elucidated by other motives? The dream interpreter should not permit his own intelligence to operate in disregard of the dreamer's impressions. This interpretation of the dream as a reminiscence of Gulliver's Travels is, by the way, a good example of how an interpretation should not be made. The dream interpreter should not permit his own intelligence to operate in disregard of the dreamer's impressions. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 4. Internal sensory excitations, organic somatic stimuli, and psychical sources of stimulation. All objections to the contrary notwithstanding, we must admit that the role of the objective sensory stimuli as producers of dreams has been indisputably established, and if, having regard to their nature and their frequency, these stimuli seem perhaps insufficient to explain all dream pictures, this indicates that we should look for other dream sources which act in a similar fashion. I do not know where the idea first arose that together with the external sensory stimuli, the internal subjective stimuli should also be considered. But as a matter of fact, this has been done more or less explicitly in all the more recent descriptions of the etology of dreams. I believe, says Wundt, that an important part is played in dream illusions by those subjective sensations of sight and hearing which are familiar to us in the waking state, as a luminous chaos in the dark field of the vision, and a ringing, buzzing, etc. of the ears, and in especial subjective irritations of the retina. This explains the remarkable tendency of dreams to delude the eyes with numbers of similar or identical objects. Thus we see outspread before our eyes innumerable birds, butterflies, fishes, coloured beads, flowers, etc. Here the luminous dust in the dark field of vision has assumed fantastic forms, and the many luminous points of which it consists are embodied in our dreams in as many single images, which, owing to the mobility of the luminous chaos, are seen as moving objects. This is perhaps the reason of the dream's decided preference for the most varied animal forms, for owing to the multiplicity of such forms, they can readily adapt themselves to the subjective luminous images. The subjective sensory stimuli, as a source of dreams, have the obvious advantage that, unlike objective stimuli, they are independent of external accidents. They are, so to speak, at the disposal of the interpretation whenever they are required, but they are inferior to the objective sensory stimuli by the fact that their claim to the role of dream inciters, which observation and experiment have established in the case of objective stimuli, can in their case be verified with difficulty or not at all. The main proof of the dream inciting power of subjective sensory stimuli is afforded by the so-called hypnagogic hallucinations, which have been described by Johann Müller as fantastic visual manifestations. They are those very vivid and changeable pictures which with many people occur constantly during the period of falling asleep, and which may linger for a while even after the eyes have been opened. Maury, who was very subject to these pictures, made a thorough study of them, and maintained that they were related to, or rather identical with, dream images. This had already been asserted by Johann Müller, Maury maintains that a certain psychic passivity is necessary for their origin, that it requires a relaxation of the intensity of attention, but one may perceive a hypnagogic hallucination in any frame of mind, if one falls into such lethargy for a moment, after which one may perhaps wake up, until this oft-repeated process terminates in sleep. According to Maury, if one wakes up shortly after such an experience, it is often possible to trace in the dream the images which one has perceived before falling asleep as hypnagogic hallucinations. Thus Maury, on one occasion, saw a series of images of grotesque figures with distorted features and curiously dressed hair, which obtruded themselves upon him with incredible importunity during the period of falling asleep, and which, upon waking, he recalled having seen in his dream. On another occasion, while suffering from hunger, because he was subjecting himself to a rather strict diet, he saw in one of his hypnagogic states a plate, and a hand armed with a fork taking some food from the plate. In his dream he found himself at a table abundantly supplied with food, and heard the clatter of the diners' forks. On yet another occasion, after falling asleep with strained and painful eyes, he had a hypnagogic hallucination of microscopically small characters, which he was able to decipher one by one, only with a great effort. And on waking from sleep an hour later, he recalled a dream in which there was an open book with very small letters, which he was obliged to read through with laborious effort. Not only pictures, but auditory hallucinations of words, names, etc. may also occur hypnagogically, and then repeat themselves in the dream, like an overture announcing the principal motif of the opera which is to follow. A more recent observer of hypnagogic hallucinations, G. Trumbull Ladd, follows the same lines as Johann Müller and Maury. By dint of practice, he succeeded in acquiring the faculty of suddenly arousing himself without opening his eyes 2 to 5 minutes after gradually falling asleep. This enabled him to compare the disappearing retinal sensations with the dream images remaining in his memory. He assures us that an intimate relation between the two can always be recognized, inasmuch as the luminous dots and lines of light spontaneously perceived by the retina produce, so to speak, the outline or scheme of the psychically perceived dream images. For example, a dream in which he saw before him clearly printed lines, which he read and studied, corresponded with a number of luminous spots arranged in parallel lines, or, to express it in his own words, the clearly printed page resolved itself into an object which appeared to his waking perception like part of an actual printed page seen through a small hole in a sheet of paper, but at a distance too great to permit of its being read. Without in any way underestimating the central element of the phenomenon, Ladd believes that hardly any visual dream occurs in our minds that is not based on material furnished by this internal condition of retinal irritability. This is particularly true of dreams which occur shortly after falling asleep in a dark room, while dreams occurring in the morning, near the period of waking, receive their stimulus from the objective light penetrating the eye in a brightly lit room. The shifting and infinitely variable character of the spontaneous luminous excitations of the retina exactly corresponds with the fitful succession of images presented to us in our dreams. If we attach any importance to Ladd's observations, we cannot underrate the productiveness of this subjective source of stimuli, for visual images, as we know, are the principal constituents of our dreams. The share contributed by the other senses, excepting, perhaps, the sense of hearing, is relatively insignificant and inconsistent. Part 3. Internal, organic, physical stimuli. If we are disposed to look for the sources of dreams not outside but inside the organism, we must remember that almost all our internal organs, which in a state of health hardly remind us of their existence, may, in states of excitation, as we call them, or in disease, become a source of the most painful sensations, and must, therefore, be put on a par with the external excitants of pain and sensation. Strumpel, for example, gives expression to a long familiar experience when he declares that during sleep the psyche becomes far more deeply and broadly conscious of its corporality than in the waking state, and it is compelled to receive and to be influenced by certain stimulating impressions originating in parts of the body, and in alterations of the body of which it is unconscious in the waking state. Even Aristotle declares it to be quite possible that a dream may draw our attention to incipient morbid conditions which we have not noticed in the waking state, owing to the exaggerated intensity of the impressions experienced in the dream, and some medical authors, who certainly did not believe in the prophetic nature of dreams, have admitted the significance of dreams, at least in so far as the predicting of disease is concerned. Compare M. Simon and many earlier writers. In addition to the diagnostic valuation of dreams, for example by Hippocrates, mention must also be made of their therapeutic significance in antiquity. Among the Greeks there were dream oracles, which were vouchsafed to patients in quest of recovery. The patient betook himself to the temple of Apollo, or Aesculapius. There he was subjected to various ceremonies, bathed, rubbed, and perfumed. A state of exaltation having been thus induced, he was made to lie down in the temple on the skin of a sacrificial ram. He fell asleep and dreamed of remedies which he saw in their natural form, or in symbolic images which the priests afterwards interpreted. Even in our days, there seems to be no lack of authenticated examples of such diagnostic achievements on the part of dreams. Thus Tissy cites from Artigue, Essai sur la valeur sémiologique des rêves, the history of a woman of 43 who during several years of apparently perfect health was troubled with anxiety dreams, and in whom a medical examination subsequently revealed an incipient affection of the heart, to which she presently succumbed. Serious derangements of the internal organs clearly excite dreams in quite a number of persons. The frequency of anxiety dreams in diseases of the heart and lungs has been generally realized. Indeed, this function of the dream life is emphasized by so many writers that I shall here content myself with a reference to the literature of the subject: Radastock, Spitter, Maury, M. Simon, Tissy. Tissy even believes that the diseased organs impress upon the dream content its characteristic features. The dreams of persons suffering from diseases of the heart are generally very brief, and end in a terrified awakening. Death under terrible circumstances almost always find a place in their content. Those suffering from diseases of the lungs dream of suffocation, of being crushed, and of flight, and a great many of them are subject to the familiar nightmare, which, by the way, Borner has succeeded in inducing experimentally by lying on the face and covering the mouth and nostrils. In digestive disturbances, the dream contains ideas from the sphere of gustatory enjoyment and disgust. Finally, the influence of sexual excitement on the dream content is obvious enough in everyone's experience, and provides the strongest confirmation of the whole theory of dream instigation by organic sensation. Moreover, if we study the literature of dreams, it becomes quite evident that some writers, such as Maury or Weygand, have been led to the study of dream problems by the influence their own pathological state has had on the content of their dreams. The enlargement of the number of dream sources by such undeniably established facts is, however, not so important as one might be led to suppose. For dreams are, after all, phenomena which occur in healthy persons, perhaps in all persons, and every night, and a pathological state of the organs is evidently not one of the indispensable conditions. For us, however, the question is not whence particular dreams originate, but rather, what is the exciting cause of ordinary dreams in normal people? But we have only to go a step farther to find a source of dreams which is more prolific than any of those mentioned above, and which promises indeed to be inexhaustible. If it is established that the bodily organs become, in sickness, an exciting source of dreams, and if we admit that the mind, when diverted during sleep from the outer world, can devote more of its attention to the interior of the body, we may readily assume that the organs need not necessarily become diseased in order to permit stimuli, which in one way or another grow into dream images, to reach the sleeping mind. What in the waking state we vaguely perceive as a general sensation, perceptible by its quality alone, a sensation to which, in the opinion of physicians, all the organic systems contribute their share, this general sensation would at night attain a greater potency, and, acting through its individual components, would constitute the most prolific as well as the most usual source of dream representations. We should then have to discover the laws by which organic stimuli are translated into dream representations. This theory of the origin of dreams is the one most favoured by all medical writers. The obscurity which conceals the essence of our being, the moi splanknik, as Tissy terms it, from our knowledge, and the obscurity of the origin of dreams correspond so closely that it was inevitable that they should be brought into relation with one another. The theory according to which the organic sensations are responsible for dreams has, moreover, another attraction for the physician, inasmuch as it favours the etiological union of the dream with mental derangement, both of which reveal so many points of agreement in their manifestations, since changes in the general organic massive sensation and in the stimuli emanating from the internal organs are also considered to have a far-reaching significance as regards the origin of the psychoses. It is therefore not surprising that the organic stimulus theory can be traced to several writers who have propounded this theory independently. A number of writers have followed the train of thought developed by Schopenhauer in 1851. Our conception of the universe has its origin in the recasting by the intellect of the impressions which reach it from without in the moulds of time, space, and causality. During the day, the stimuli proceeding from the interior of the organism, from the sympathetic nervous system, exert at most an unconscious influence on our mood. At night, however, when the overwhelming effect of the impressions of the day is no longer operative, the impressions that surge upward from within are able to force themselves on our attention, just as in the night we hear the rippling of the brook that was drowned in the clamour of the day. But how else can the intellect react to these stimuli than by transforming them, in accordance with its own function, into things which occupy space and time, and follow the lines of causality, and so a dream originates. Thus Skerner, and after him Volkert, endeavoured to discover the more intimate relations between physical sensations and dream pictures. But we shall reserve the discussion of this point for our chapter on the theory of dreams. As a result of a singularly logical analysis, the psychiatrist Krauss referred the origin of dreams, and also of deliria and delusions, to the same element, namely, to organically determined sensations. According to him, there is hardly any part of the organism which might not become the starting point of a dream or a delusion. Organically determined sensations, he says, may be divided into two classes. 1. General sensations, those affecting the whole system. 2. Specific sensations, those that are immanent in the principal systems of the vegetative organism, and which may in turn be subdivided into 5 groups: A. The muscular, B. The pneumatic, C. The gastric, D. The sexual, E. The peripheral sensations. The origin of the dream image from physical sensations is conceived by Krauss as follows. The awakened sensation, in accordance with some law of association, evokes an idea or image bearing some relation to it, and combines with this idea or image, forming an organic structure towards which, however, the consciousness does not maintain its normal attitude. For it does not bestow any attention on the sensation, but concerns itself entirely with the accompanying ideas, and this explains why the facts of the case have been so long misunderstood. Krauss even gives this process the special name of transubstantiation of the sensations into dream images. The influence of organic physical stimuli on the formation of dreams is today almost universally admitted, but the question as to the nature of the law underlying this relation is answered in various ways, and often obscurely. On the basis of the theory of physical excitation, the special task of dream interpretation is to trace back the content of a dream to the causative organic stimulus, and if we do not accept the rules of interpretation advanced by Skerner, we shall often find ourselves confronted by the awkward fact that the organic source of excitation reveals itself only in the content of the dream. A certain agreement, however, appears in the interpretation of the various forms of dreams which have been designated as typical, because they recur in so many persons with almost the same content. Among these are the well-known dreams of falling from a height, of the dropping out of teeth, of flying, and of embarrassment because one is naked or scantily clad. This last type of dream is said to be caused simply by the dreamer's perception, felt in his sleep, that he is thrown off the bedclothes and is uncovered. The dream that one's teeth are dropping out is explained by dental irritation, which does not, however, of necessity imply a morbid condition of irritability of the teeth. According to Strumpel, the flying dream is the adequate image employed by the mind to interpret the quantum of stimulus emanating from the rising and sinking of the pulmonary lobes when the cutaneous sensation of the thorax has lapsed into insensibility. This latter condition causes the sensation which gives rise to images of hovering in the air. The dream of falling from a height is said to be due to the fact that an arm falls away from the body, or a flexed knee is suddenly extended, after unconsciousness of the sensation of cutaneous pressure has supervened, whereupon this sensation returns to consciousness, and the transition from unconsciousness to consciousness embodies itself psychically as a dream of falling. The weakness of these fairly plausible attempts at explanation clearly lies in the fact that without any further elucidation they allow this or that group of organic sensations to disappear from psychic perception, or to obtrude themselves upon it, until the constellation favourable for the explanation has been established. Later on, however, I shall have occasion to return to the subject of typical dreams and their origin. From a comparison of a series of similar dreams, Monsieur Simon endeavoured to formulate certain rules governing the influence of organic sensations on the nature of the resulting dream. He says, if during sleep any organic apparatus which normally participates in the expression of an affect for any reason enters into the state of excitation to which it is usually aroused by the affect, the dream thus produced will contain representations which harmonize with that affect. Another rule reads as follows: if, during sleep, an organic apparatus is in a state of activity, stimulation, or disturbance, the dream will present ideas which correspond with the nature of the organic function performed by that apparatus. Morley-Vold has undertaken to prove the supposed influence of bodily sensation on the production of dreams by experimenting on a single physiological territory. He changed the positions of a sleeper's limbs and compared the resulting dreams with these changes. He recorded the following results. 1. The position of a limb in a dream corresponds approximately to that of reality. That is, we dream of a static condition of the limb which corresponds with the actual condition. 2. When one dreams of a moving limb, it always happens that one of the positions occurring in the execution of this movement corresponds with the actual position. 3. The position of one's own limb may in the dream be attributed to another person. 4. One may also dream that the movement in question is impeded. 5. The limb in any particular position may appear in the dream as an animal or monster, in which case a certain analogy between the two is established. 6. The behaviour of a limb may in the dream incite ideas which bear some relation or other to this limb. Thus, for example, if we are using our fingers, we dream of numerals. Results such as these would lead me to conclude that even the theory of organic stimulation cannot entirely abolish the apparent freedom of the determination of the dream picture which will be evoked. Part 4. Psychic sources of excitation. When considering the relation of dreams to waking life and the provenance of the material of dreams, we learned that the earliest as well as the most recent investigators are agreed that men dream of what they do during the day and of the things that interest them in the waking state. This interest, continued from waking life into sleep, is not only a psychic bond joining the dream to life, but it is also a source of dreams whose importance must not be underestimated, and which, taken together with those stimuli which become active and of interest during sleep, suffices to explain the origin of all dream images. Yet we have also heard the very contrary of this asserted, namely, that dreams bear the sleeper away from the interests of the day, and that in most cases we do not dream of things which have occupied our attention during the day until after they have lost. For our waking life, the stimulating force of belonging to the present. Hence, in the analysis of dream life, we are reminded at every step that it is inadmissible to frame general rules without making provision for qualifications by introducing such terms as frequently, as a rule, in most cases, and without being prepared to admit the validity of exceptions. If interest during the waking state, together with the internal and external stimuli that occur during sleep, suffice to cover the whole etiology of dreams, we should be in a position to give a satisfactory account of the origin of all the elements of a dream. The problem of the dream sources would then be solved, leaving us only the task of discriminating between the part played by the psychic and that played by the somatic dream stimuli in individual dreams. But, as a matter of fact, no such complete solution of a dream has ever been achieved in any case, and everyone who has attempted such a solution has found that components of the dream, and usually a great many of them, are left whose source he is unable to trace. The interests of the day as a psychic source of dreams are obviously not so influential as to justify the confident assertion that every dreamer continues the activities of his waking life in his dreams. Other dream sources of a psychic nature are not known. Hence, with the exception perhaps of the explanation of dreams given by Skerner, to which reference will be made later on, all the explanations found in the literature of the subject show a considerable hiatus whenever there is a question of tracing the images and ideas which are the most characteristic material of dreams. In this dilemma, the majority of authors have developed a tendency to belittle, as far as possible, the share of the psychic factor, which is so difficult to determine in the evocation of dreams. To be sure, they distinguish as major divisions the nerve stimulus dream and the association dream, and assert that the latter has its source exclusively in reproduction. But they cannot dismiss the doubt as to whether they appear without any impulsion from organic stimuli, and even the characteristic quality of the pure association dream disappears. To quote Volquet, in the association dream proper, there is no longer any question of such a stable nucleus. Here the loose grouping penetrates even to the very centre of the dream. The imaginative life, already released from the control of reason and intellect, is here no longer held together by the more important psychical and physical stimuli, but is left to its own uncontrolled and confused divagations. Wundt too attempts to belittle the psychic factor in the evocation of dreams by asserting that the phantasms of the dream are perhaps unjustly regarded as pure hallucinations. Probably most dream representations are really illusions, inasmuch as they emanate from the slight sensory impressions which are never extinguished during sleep. Weygand has adopted this view and generalizes upon it. He asserts that the most immediate causes of all dream representations are sensory stimuli to which reproductive associations then attach themselves. Tissy goes still further in suppressing the psychic sources of excitation. Les rêves d'origine absolument psychique n'existent pas, and elsewhere, les pensées de nos rêves ne viennent de dehors. Those writers who, like the eminent philosopher Wundt, adopt a middle course, do not hesitate to assert that, in most dreams, there is a cooperation of the somatic stimuli and the psychic stimuli, which are either unknown or are identified with the interests of the day. We shall learn later that the problem of dream formation may be solved by the disclosure of an entirely unsuspected psychic source of excitation. In the meanwhile, we shall not be surprised at the overestimation of the influence of those stimuli which do not originate in the psychic life. It is not merely because they alone may easily be found, and even confirmed by experiment, but because the somatic conception of the origin of dreams entirely corresponds with the mode of thought prevalent in modern psychiatry. Here, it is true, the mastery of the brain over the organism is most emphatically stressed, but everything that might show that the psychic life is independent of demonstrable organic changes or spontaneous in its manifestations is alarming to the contemporary psychiatrist, as though such an admission must mean a return to the old world natural philosophy and the metaphysical conception of the nature of the soul. The distrust of the psychiatrist has placed the psyche under tutelage, so to speak. It requires that none of the impulses of the psyche shall reveal an autonomous power. Yet this attitude merely betrays a lack of confidence in the stability of the causal concatenation between the physical and the psychic. Even where on investigation the psychic may be recognized as the primary cause of a phenomenon, a more profound comprehension of the subject will one day succeed in following up the path that leads to the organic basis of the psychic. But where the psychic must, in the present state of our knowledge, be accepted as the terminus, it need not on that account be disavowed. End of section 4. Recording by Steve Chilvers, Norwich, England. Section 5 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. Section 5. Why Dreams are Forgotten After Waking. That a dream fades away in the morning is proverbial. It is, indeed, possible to recall it, for we know the dream, of course, only by recalling it after waking. But we very often believe that we remember it incompletely, that during the night there was more of it than we remember. We may observe how the memory of a dream, which in the morning was still vivid, fades in the course of the day, leaving only a few trifling remnants. We are often aware that we have been dreaming, but we do not know of what we have dreamed, and we are so well used to this fact that the dream is liable to be forgotten, that we do not reject as absurd the possibility that we may have been dreaming even when, in the morning, we know nothing either of the content of the dream or of the fact that we have dreamed. On the other hand, it often happens that dreams manifest an extraordinary power of maintaining themselves in the memory. I have had occasion to analyze, with my patients, dreams which occurred to them 25 years or more previously, and I can remember a dream of my own which is divided from the present day by at least 37 years, and yet has lost nothing of its freshness in my memory. All this is very remarkable, and for the present incomprehensible. The forgetting of dreams is treated in the most detailed manner by Strumpel. This forgetting is evidently a complex phenomenon, for Strumpel attributes it not to a single cause, but to quite a number of causes. In the first place, all those factors which induce forgetfulness in the waking state determine also the forgetting of dreams. In the waking state, we commonly very soon forget a great many sensations and perceptions, because they are too slight to remember, and because they are charged with only a slight amount of emotional feeling. This is true also of many dream images. They are forgotten because they are too weak, while the stronger images in their neighbourhood are remembered. However, the factor of intensity is in itself not the only determinant of the preservation of dream images. Strumpel, as well as other authors, such as Calkins, admits that dream images are often rapidly forgotten, although they are known to have been vivid, whereas, among those that are retained in the memory, there are many that are very shadowy and unmeaning. Besides, in the waking state, one is wont to forget rather easily things that have happened only once, and to remember more readily things which occur repeatedly. But most dream images are unique experiences, and this peculiarity would contribute towards the forgetting of all dreams equally. Of much greater significance is a third cause of forgetting. In order that feelings, representations, ideas and the like should attain a certain degree of memorability, it is important that they should not remain isolated, but that they should enter into connections and associations of an appropriate nature. If the words of a verse of poetry are taken and mixed together, it will be very difficult to remember them. Properly placed, in a significant sequence, one word helps another, and the whole, making sense, remains and is easily and lastingly fixed in the memory. Contradictions, as a rule, are retained, with just as much difficulty and just as rarely as things that are confused and disorderly. Now dreams, in most cases, lack sense and order. Dream compositions, by their very nature, are insusceptible of being remembered, and they are forgotten because, as a rule, they fall to pieces the very next moment. To be sure, these conclusions are not entirely consistent with Raderstock's observation that we most readily pertain just those dreams which are most peculiar. Periodically recurrent dreams have been observed repeatedly. Compare the collection made by Chaboneau. According to Strumpel, other factors, deriving from the relation of the dream to the waking state, are even more effective in causing us to forget our dreams. The forgetfulness of dreams manifested by the waking consciousness is evidently merely the counterpart of the fact already mentioned, namely, that the dream hardly ever takes over an orderly series of memories from the waking state, but only certain details of those memories, which it removes from the habitual psychic connections in which they are remembered in the waking state. The dream composition, therefore, has no place in the community of the psychic series, which fill the mind. It lacks all mnemonic aids. In this manner the dream structure rises, as it were, from the soil of our psychic life, and floats in psychic space like a cloud in the sky, quickly dispelled by the first breath of reawakening life. This situation is accentuated by the fact that on waking, the attention is immediately besieged by the inrushing world of sensation, so that very few dream images are capable of withstanding its force. They fade away before the impressions of the new day, like the stars before the light of the sun. Finally, we should remember that the fact that most people take but little interest in their dreams is conducive to the forgetting of dreams. Anyone who for some time applies himself to the investigation of dreams and takes a special interest in them usually dreams more during that period than at any other. He remembers his dreams more easily and more frequently. Two other reasons for the forgetting of dreams, which Bonatelli, cited by Bernini, adds to those adduced by Strumpel, have already been included in those enumerated above, namely, 1. That the difference of the general sensation in the sleeping and the waking state is unfavourable to mutual reproduction, and 2. That the different arrangements of the material in the dream makes the dream untranslatable, so to speak, for the waking consciousness. It is therefore all the more remarkable, as Strumpel himself observes, that, in spite of all these reasons for forgetting the dream, so many dreams are retained in the memory. The continual efforts of those who have written on the subject to formulate laws for the remembering of dreams amount to an admission that here, too, there is something puzzling and unexplained. Certain peculiarities relating to the remembering of dreams have attracted particular attention of late. For example, the fact that the dream, which is believed to be forgotten in the morning, may be recalled in the course of the day, on the occasion of some perception which accidentally touches the forgotten content of the dream. Reference Radestock-Tissy. But the whole recollection of dreams is open to an objection which is calculated greatly to depreciate its value in critical eyes. One may doubt whether our memory, which omits so much from the dream, does not falsify what it retains. This doubt as to the exactness of the reproduction of dreams is expressed by Strumpel when he says, "It may therefore easily happen that the waking consciousness involuntarily interpolates a great many things in the recollection of the dream. One imagines that one has dreamt all sorts of things which the actual dream did not contain." Jessen expresses himself in very decided terms. Moreover, we must not lose sight of the fact, hitherto little heeded, that in the investigation and interpretation of coherent and logical dreams, we almost always take liberties with the truth when we recall a dream to memory. Unconsciously and unintentionally, we fill up the gaps and supplement the dream images. Rarely, and perhaps never, has a connected dream been as connected as it appears to us in memory. Even the most truth-loving person can hardly relate a dream without exaggerating and embellishing it in some degree. The human mind so greatly tends to perceive everything in a connected form that it intentionally supplies the missing links in any dream, which is in some degree incoherent. The observations of V. Eggers, though of course independently conceived, read almost like a translation of Jesson's words. L'observation de rêve a ses difficultés spéciales et le seul moyen d'éviter toute erreur en pareille matière est de confier au papier sans le moindre retard ce que l'on vient de prouver et de remarquer. Sinon, l'oubli vient vite, ou total ou partiel, l'oubli total en sans gravité, mais l'oubli partiel est perfide, car si l'on se met ensuite à raconter ce que l'on n'a pas oublié, on expose et complète par imagination les fragments incohérents et déchouants fournis par la mémoire. On devient autiste à son insu, et le récit, périodiquement répété, s'impose à la créance de son autre, qui, de bonne foi, les présenter comme un fait authentique du monde à table selon les bonnes méthodes. The observation of dreams has its special difficulties, and the only way to avoid all error in such matter is to put on paper without the least delay what has just been experienced and noticed. Otherwise, totally or partially, the dream is quickly forgotten. Total forgetting is without seriousness, but partial forgetting is treacherous. For, if one then starts to recount what has not been forgotten, one is likely to supplement from the imagination the incoherent and disjointed fragments provided by the memory. Unconsciously, one becomes an artist, and the story, repeated from time to time, imposes itself on the belief of its author, who, in good faith, tells it as authentic fact, regularly established according to proper methods. Similarly, Spitter, who seems to think that it is only in the attempt to reproduce the dream that we bring order and arrangement into loosely associated dream elements, turning juxtaposition into concatenation, that is, adding the process of logical connection which is absent in the dream. Since we can test the reliability of our memory only by objective means, and since such a test is impossible in the case of dreams, which are our own personal experience, and for which we know no other source than our memory, what value do our recollections of our dreams possess? End of section 5. Recording by Steve Chilvers, Norwich, England.
Section 6 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Chapter 6. The Psychological Peculiarities of Dreams. In our scientific investigation of dreams, we start with the assumption that dreams are a phenomenon of our own psychic activity. Yet, the completed dream appears to us as something alien, whose authorship we are little inclined to recognize, that we should be just as willing to say, "A dream came to me," as "I dreamed." Whence this psychic strangeness of dreams? According to our exposition of the sources of dreams, we must assume that it is not determined by the material which finds its way into the dream content, since this is for the most part common both to dream life and waking life. We might ask ourselves whether this impression is not evoked by modifications of psychic process in dreams, and We might even attempt to suggest that the existence of such changes is the psychological characteristic of dreams. No one has more strongly emphasized the essential difference between dream life and waking life and drawn more far-reaching conclusions from this difference than G. T. H. Fechner in certain observations contained in his Element der Psychophysik. He believed that neither the simple depression of conscious psychic life under the main threshold, nor the distraction of the attention from the influences of the outer world suffices to explain the peculiarities of dream life as compared with the waking life. He believes rather that the arena of dreams is other than the arena of the waking life of the mind. If the arena of psychophysical activity were the same during the sleeping and the waking state, the dream, in my opinion, would only be a continuation of the waking ideational life at a lower degree of intensity, so that it would have to partake of the form and material of the latter. But this is by no means the case. What Fechner really meant by such a transposition of the psychic activity has never been made clear, nor has anybody else, to my knowledge, followed the path which he indicates in this remark. An anatomical interpretation in the sense of physiological localization in the brain, or even a histological stratification of the cerebral cortex, must of course be excluded. The idea might, however, prove ingenious and fruitful if it could refer to a psychical apparatus built up of a number of successive and connected systems. Other authors have been content to give prominence to this or that palpable psychological peculiarity of the dream life, and even to take this as a starting point for more comprehensive attempts at explanation. It has been justly remarked that one of the chief peculiarities of dream life makes its appearance even in the state of falling asleep, and may be defined as the sleep heralding phenomenon. According to Schleiermacher, the distinguishing characteristic of waking state is the fact that its psychic activity occurs in the form of ideas rather than in that of images. But dream thinks mainly in visual images. And it may be noted that with the approach of sleep, the voluntary activities become impeded in proportion as involuntary representations make their appearance, the latter belonging entirely to the category of images. The incapacity for such ideational activities as we feel to be deliberately willed, and the emergence of visual images, which is regularly connected with this distraction, these two are constant characteristic of dreams. And on psychological analysis, we are compelled to recognize them as essential characteristics of dream life. As for the images themselves, the hypnagogic hallucinations, we have learned that even in their content, they are identical with dream images. Dreams, then, think preponderantly, but not exclusively, in visual images. They make use also of auditory images, and to a lesser extent of the other sensory impressions. Moreover, in dreams, as in the waking state, many things are simply thought and imagined, probably with the help of remnants of verbal conceptions. Characteristic of dreams, however, are only those elements of their contents which behave like images, that is, which more closely resemble perceptions than mnemonic representations. Without entering upon a discussion of nature of hallucinations, a discussion familiar to every psychiatrist, we may say, with every well-informed authority, that the dream hallucinates, that is, that it replaces thoughts by hallucinations. In this respect, visual and acoustic impressions behave in the same way. It has been observed that the recollection of a succession of notes heard as we are falling asleep becomes transformed. When we have fallen asleep, into a hallucination of the same melody, to give place, each time we wake, to the fainter and qualitatively different representations of the memory, and resuming, each time we doze off again, its hallucinatory character. The transformation of an idea into a hallucination is not the only departure of the dream from the more or less corresponding waking thought. From these images, the dream creates a situation. It represents something as actually present. It dramatizes an idea, as Peter puts it. But the peculiar character of this aspect of the dream life is completely intelligible only if we admit that in dreaming, we do not, as a rule, the exceptions call for special examination, suppose ourselves to be thinking, but actually experiencing. That is, we accept the hallucinations in perfectly good faith. The criticism that one has experienced nothing, but that one has merely been thinking in a peculiar manner, dreaming, occurs to us only on waking. It is this characteristic which distinguishes the genuine dream from the daydream, which is never confused with reality. The characteristics of the dream life, thus far considered, have been summed up by Budak as follows. As characteristic features of the dream, we may state A. That the subjective activity of our psyche appears as objective, inasmuch as our perceptive faculties apprehend the products of fantasy as though they were sensory activities. B. That sleep abrogates our voluntary action, hence falling asleep involves a certain degree of passivity. The images of sleep are conditioned by the relaxation of our powers of will. It now remains to account for the credulity of the mind in respect to the dream hallucinations, which are able to make their appearance only after the suspension of certain voluntary powers. Strumpel asserts that in this respect the psyche behaves correctly and in conformity with its mechanism. The dream elements are by no means mere representations, but true and actual experiences of the psyche, similar to those which come to the waking state by the way of senses. Whereas, in the waking state, the mind thinks and imagines by means of verbal images and language. In dream, it thinks and imagines in actual perceptual images. Dreams, moreover, reveal a spatial consciousness, inasmuch as in dreams, just as in the waking state, sensations and images are transposed into outer space. It must therefore be admitted that in dreams, the mind preserves the same attitude in respect of images and perceptions as in the waking state. But if it forms erroneous conclusions in respect of these images and perceptions, this is due to the fact that in sleep it is deprived of that criterion which alone can distinguish between sensory perceptions emanating from within and those coming from without. It is unable to subject its images to those tests which alone can prove their objective reality. Further, it neglects to differentiate between those images which can be exchanged at will and those in respect of which there is no free choice. It does because it cannot apply the law of causality to the content of its dreams. In brief, its alienation from the outer world is the very reason for its belief in the subjective dream world. Delboeuf arrives at the same conclusion through a somewhat different line of argument. We believe in the reality of dream pictures because in sleep we have no other impressions with which to compare them, because we are cut off from the outer world. But it is not because we are unable, when asleep, to test our hallucinations that we believe in their reality. Dreams can make us believe that we are applying such tests, that we are touching, say, the rose that we see in our dream, and yet we are dreaming. According to Delboeuf, there is no valid criterion that can show whether something is a dream or a waking reality, except, and that only pragmatically, the fact of waking. I conclude that all that has been experienced between falling asleep and waking is a delusion. If I find on waking that I am lying undressed in bed, I considered the images of my dream real while I was asleep on the account of unsleeping mental habit of assuming an outer world with which I can contrast my ego. Hafner, like Delbach, has attempted to explain the act of dreaming by the alteration which an abnormally introduced condition must have upon the otherwise correct functioning of the intact psychic apparatus. But he describes this condition in a somewhat different terms. He states that the first distinguishing mark of dreams is the abolition of time and space, that is, the emancipation of the representation from the individual's position in the spatial and temporal order. Associated with this is the second fundamental character of dreams, the mistaking of the hallucinations, imaginations, and fantasy combinations for objective perceptions. The sum total of the higher psychic functions, particularly the formation of concepts, judgments, and conclusions on the one hand, and the free self-determination on the other hand, combined with the sensory fantasy images, and at all times have these as substratum. These activities too, therefore, participate in the erratic nature of the dream representations. We say they participate, for our faculties of judgment and will are in themselves unaltered during sleep. As far as their activity is concerned, we are just as shrewd and just as free as in the waking state. A man cannot violate the laws of thought. That is, even in a dream, he cannot judge things to be identical, which present themselves to him as opposites. He can desire in a dream only that which he regards as good. Sub ratione boni. But in this application of the laws of thought and will, the human intellect is led astray in dreams by confusing one notion with another. Thus it happens that in dreams we formulate and commit the greatest of contradictions, while on the other hand we display the shrewdest judgment and arrive at the most logical conclusions and are able to make the most virtuous and sacred resolutions. The lack of orientation is the whole secret of our flights of fantasy in dreams, and the lack of critical reflection and agreement with other minds is the main source of the reckless extravagances of our judgments, hopes, and wishes in dreams. If the turning away from the outer world is accepted as the decisive cause of the most conspicuous characteristics of our dreams, it will be worth our while to consider certain subtle observations of Buddhas, which will throw some light on the relation of the sleeping psyche to the outer world, and at the same time serve to prevent the overestimating the importance of the above deductions. Sleep, says Buddha, results only under the condition that the mind is not excited by sensory stimuli. Yet, it is not so much a lack of sensory stimuli that conditions sleep, as a lack of interest in them. Some sensory impressions are even necessary in so far as they serve to calm the mind. Thus, the miller can fall asleep only when he hears the clatter of his mill, and he who finds it necessary, as a matter of precaution, to burn a light at night cannot fall asleep in the dark. During sleep, the psyche isolates itself from the outer world and withdraws from the periphery. Nevertheless, the connection is not entirely broken. If one did not hear and feel during sleep, but only after waking, one would assuredly never be awakened at all. The continuance of sensation is even more plainly shown by the fact that we are not always awakened by the mere force of the sensory impression, but by its relation to the psyche. An indifferent word does not arouse the sleeper, but if called by name, he wakes. So that, even in sleep, the psyche discriminates between sensations. Hence, One may even be awakened by the obliteration of a sensory stimulus, if this is related to anything of the imagined importance. Thus one man wakes when the night light is extinguished, and the miller when his mill comes to a standstill. That is, waking is due to the cessation of a sensory activity, and this presupposes that the activity has been perceived but has not disturbed the mind, its effect being indifferent or actually reassuring. Even if we are willing to disregard these by no means trifling objections, we must yet admit that the qualities of the dream life, hitherto considered, which are attributed to withdrawal from the outer world, cannot fully account for the strangeness of dreams. For otherwise, it would be possible to reconvert the hallucinations of the dream into mental images and the situations of the dreams into thoughts, and thus to achieve the task of dream interpretation. Now this is precisely what we do when we reproduce a dream from memory after waking. And no matter whether we are fully or only partially successful in this retranslation, the dream still remains as mysterious as before. Furthermore, all writers unhesitatingly assume that still other and profounder changes take place in the plastic material of waking life. Strumpel seeks to isolate one of these changes as follows. With the cessation of active sensory perception and of normal consciousness, the psyche is deprived of the soil in which its feelings, desires, interests, and activities are rooted. Those psychic states, feelings, interests, and valuations, which in the waking state adhere to the memory images, succumb to an obscuring pressure, in consequence of which their connection with these images is severed. The perceptual images of things, persons, localities, events, and actions of the waking state are individually, abundantly reproduced, but none of these brings with it its psychic value. Deprived of this, they hover in the mind, dependent on their own resources. The annihilation of psychic values, which is in turn referred to a turning away from the outer world, is, according to Strumpel, very largely responsible for the impression of strangeness with which the dream is colored in our memory. We have seen that the very fact of falling asleep involves a renunciation of one of the psychic activities, namely, the voluntary guidance of the flow of ideas. Thus, the supposition obtrudes itself, though it is in any case a natural one, that the state of sleep may extend even to the psychic functions. One or another of these functions is perhaps entirely suspended. We have now to consider whether the rest continue to operate undisturbed, whether they are able to perform their normal work under the circumstances. The idea occurs to us that the peculiarities of the dream may be explained by the restricted activity of the psyche during sleep, and the impression made by the dream upon our waking judgment tends to confirm this view. The dream is incoherent. It reconciles, without hesitation, the worst contradictions. It admits impossibilities. It disregards the authoritative knowledge of the waking state, and it shows us as ethically and morally obtuse. He who should behave in the waking state as his dream represents him as behaving would be considered insane. He who in the waking state should speak as he does in his dream, or relate such things as occur in his dreams, would impress us as a feeble-minded or muddle-headed person. It seems to us then that we are merely speaking in accordance with the facts of the case when we rate psychic activity in dreams very low, and especially when we assert that in dreams the higher intellectual activities are suspended or at least greatly impaired. With unusual unanimity, the exceptions will be dealt with elsewhere. The writers on the subject have pronounced such judgments as led immediately to a definitive theory and explanation of dream life. It is now time to supplement the resume which I have just given by a series of quotations from a number of authors, philosophers, and physicians bearing upon the psychological characteristics of the dream. According to Lemoine, The incoherence of the dream images is the sole essential characteristic of the dream. Maury agrees with him.
Il n'y a pas de rêve absolument raisonnable et qui ne contienne quelque incohérence, quelque absurdité.
There are no dreams which are absolutely reasonable, which do not contain some incoherence, some absurdity. According to Hegel, quoted by Spita, the dream lacks any intelligible objective coherence. Dugas says,
Le rêve, c'est l'anarchie physique, affective et mentale. C'est le jeu des fonctions livrées et elles-mêmes et exerçant sans contrôle et sans but. Dans le rêve, l'esprit est un automate spirituel.
The dream is psychic anarchy, emotional and intellectual. The playing of functions freed of themselves and performing without control and without end. In the dream, the mind is a spiritual automaton. The relaxation, dissolution, and promiscuous confusion of the world of ideas and images held together in waking life by the logical power of the central ego is conceded even by Folke, according to whose theory, the psychic activity during sleep appears to be by no means aimless. The absurdity of the associations of ideas which occur in dreams can hardly be more strongly stigmatized than it was by Cicero.
Nihil tam prepostre tam incondite, tam monstruas cogitari potast, quod non possimus dominare.
There is no imaginable thing too absurd, too involved, or too abnormal for us to dream about. Fechner says, it is as though the psychological activity of the brain of a reasonable person were to migrate into that of a fool. Radestock, it seems indeed impossible to recognize any stable laws in this preposterous behavior. Withdrawing itself from its strict policing of the rational will that guides our waking ideas and form the process of attention, the dream, in crazy sport, whirls all things about in a kaleidoscopic confusion. Hildebrand, what wonderful jumps the dreamer permits himself, for instance, in his chain of reasoning. With what unconcern he sees the most familiar laws of experience turned upside down. What ridiculous contradictions he is able to tolerate in the order of nature and of society, before things go too far, and the very excess of nonsense leads to an awakening. Sometimes we quite innocently calculate that 3 times 3 makes 20. And we are not in the least surprised if a dog recites poetry to us, if a dead person walks to his grave, or if a rock floats in the water. We solemnly go to visit the Duchy of Bernburg or the Principality of Liechtenstein in order to inspect its navy, or we allow ourselves to be recruited as a volunteer by Charles XII just before the Battle of Poltava. Binz, referring to the theory of dreams resulting from these impressions, says, of 10 dreams, 9 at least have an absurd content. We unite in them persons or things which do not appear slightest relation to one another. In the next moment, as in a kaleidoscope, the grouping changes to one, if possible, even more nonsensical and irrational than before. And so, the shifting play of the drowsy brain continues, until we wake, put a hand to our forehead, and ask ourselves whether we still really possess the faculty of rational imagination and thought. Maury Le Sommet makes in respect of the relation of the dream image to the waking thoughts a comparison which a physician will find especially impressive.
La production de ces images qui chez l'homme éveillé fait le plus souvent naître le volant, correspond pour l'intelligence et ce qui sont pour la mortalité certains moments qui nous offront la courrier et les affections paralytiques.
The production of those images which, in the waking man, most often excite the will, correspond for the mind to those which are, for the motility, certain movements that offer sensuous dance and paralytic affections. For the rest, he considers the dream
toute une série de dégradations de la faculté pensante et raisonnante.
a whole series of degradations of the faculty of thinking and reasoning. It's hardly necessary to cite the utterances of those authors who repeat Maury's assertions in respect of the higher individual psychic activities. According to Strumpel, in dreams, and even, of course, where the nonsensical nature of the dream is not obvious, all the logical operations of the mind, based on relations and associations, recede into the background. According to Spitta, ideas in dreams are entirely withdrawn from the laws of causality, while Radstock and others emphasize the feebleness of judgment and logical inference peculiar to dreams. According to Gödel, there is no criticism in dreams, no correcting of a series of perceptions by the content of consciousness as a whole. The same author states that all the activities of consciousness occur in dreams, but they are imperfect, inhibited, and mutually isolated. The contradictions of our conscious knowledge which occur in dreams are explained by Stricker and many others on the ground that facts are forgotten in dreams, or that the logical relations between ideas are lost, etc., etc. Those authors who, in general, judge so unfavorably of the psychic activities of dreamer, nevertheless agree that dreams do retain a certain remnant of psychic activity. Wundt, whose teachings has influenced so many other investigators of dream problems, expressly admits this. We may ask, what are the nature and composition of the remnants of normal psychic life which manifest themselves in dreams? It is pretty generally acknowledged that the reproductive faculty, the memory, seems to be the least affected in dreams. It may indeed show a certain superiority over the same function in waking life, even though some of the absurdities of dreams are to be explained by the forgetfulness of dream life. According to Spitta, it is the sentimental life of the psyche which is not affected by sleep, and which thus directs our dreams. By sentiment, Gemut, he means the constant sum of the emotions as the inmost subjective essence of man. Scholz sees in dreams a psychic activity which manifests itself in the allegorizing interpretation to which the dream material is subjected. Siebeck, likewise, perceives in dreams a supplementary interpretative activity of the psyche which applies itself to all that is observed and perceived. Any judgment of the part played in dreams by what is presumed to be the highest psychical function, that is consciousness, presents a peculiar difficulty, since it is only through consciousness that we can know anything of dreams. There can be no doubt as to its being retained. Spitta, however, believes that only consciousness is retained in the dream, but not self-consciousness. Delboeuf confesses that he is unable to comprehend this distinction. The laws of association, which connect our mental images, hold good also for what is represented in dreams. Indeed, in dreams, the dominance of these laws is more obvious and complete than in waking state. Strumpel says, dreams would appear to proceed either exclusively in accordance with the laws of pure representation or in accordance with the laws of organic stimuli accompanied by such representations, that is, without being influenced by reflection, reason, aesthetic taste or moral judgment. The authors whose opinions I here reproduce conceive the formation of the dream somewhat as follows. The sum of sensory stimuli of varying origin, discussed elsewhere, that are operative in sleep at first, awaken in the psyche a number of images which present themselves as hallucinations. According to Wundt, it is more correct to say as illusions, because of their origin in external and internal stimuli. These combine with one another in accordance with the known laws of association, and in accordance with the same laws, they in turn evoke a new series of representations, images. The whole of this material is then elaborated as far as possible by the still active remnant of the thinking and organizing faculties of the psyche. Thus far, however, no one has been successful in discerning the motive which would decide what particular law of association is to be obeyed by those images which do not originate in external stimuli. But it has been repeatedly observed that the associations which connect the dream images with one another are of particular kind, differing from those found in the activities of the waking mind. Thus Folke, in dreams, the ideas chase and seize upon one another on the strength of accidental similarities and barely perceptible connections. All dreams are pervaded by casual and unconstrained associations of this kind. Mori attaches great value to this characteristic of the connection of ideas, for it allows him to draw a closer analogy between the dream life and certain mental derangements. He recognizes two main characteristics of the deliria. 1.
Une action spontanée et comme automatique de l'esprit.
An action of the mind spontaneous and as though automatic. 2.
Une association vicieuse et irrégulière des idées.
A defective and irregular association of ideas. Mori gives two excellent examples from his own dreams, in which the mere similarity of sound decides the connection between the dream representations. Once he dreamed that he was in a pilgrimage, pèlerinage, to Jerusalem or to Mecca. After many adventures, he found himself in the company of the chemist Pelletier. The latter, after some conversation, gave him a galvanized shovel, Pelle, which became his great broadsword in the next portion of the dream. In another dream, he is walking along a highway where he reads the distances on the kilometer stones. Presently he found himself at a grocer's, who had a large pair of scales. A man put kilogram weights into the scales in order to weigh Mori. The grocer then said to him, "You are not in Paris, but on the island Kilolo." This was followed by a number of pictures in which he saw the flower Lobelia and then General Lopez, of whose death he had read a little while previously. Finally he awoke as he was playing a game of Lotto. We are, indeed, quite well aware that this low estimate of the psychic activities of the dream has not been allowed to pass without contradiction from various quarters. Yet, here, contradiction would seem rather difficult. It is not a matter of much significance that one of the depreciators of dream life, Spita, should assure us that the same psychological laws which govern the waking state rule the dream also, or that another, Dugas, should state,
Le rêve n'est pas de raison ni même irraison pure.
The dream is neither pure derangement nor pure irrationality. So long as neither of them has attempted to bring this opinion into harmony with the psychic anarchy and the dissolution of all mental functions in the dream, which they themselves have described. However, the possibility seems to have dawned upon others that the madness of the dream is perhaps not without its method, that it is perhaps only a disguise, a dramatic pretense, like that of Hamlet, to whose madness the perspicacious judgment refers. These authors must either have refrained from judging by appearances, or appearances were, in their case, altogether different. Without lingering over its superficial absurdity, Havelock Ellis considers the dream as an anarchic world of vast emotions and imperfect thoughts, the study of which may acquaint us with the primitive stages of the development of mental life. J. Sully presents the same conception of the dream in a still more comprehensive and penetrating fashion. His statements deserve all the more consideration when it is added that he, perhaps more than any other psychologist, was convinced of the veiled significance of the dream. Now, our dreams are a means of conserving these successive personalities. When asleep, we go back to the old ways of looking at things and of feeling about them, to impulses and activities which long ago dominated us. A thinker like Delboeuf asserts without indeed adducing proof in the face of the contradictory data, and hence without real justification.
Dans le sommeil, hormis la perception, toutes les facultés de l'esprit, intelligence, imagination, mémoire, volonté, moralité, restent intactes dans leur essence. Seulement, elles s'appliquent à des objets imaginaires et mobiles. Le sanguin est un acteur qui joue à volant, les fous et les sages, le bourreau et la victime, le néant et le géant, le démon et les anges.
In sleep, excepting perception, all the faculties of the mind, intellect, imagination, memory, will, morality remain intact in their essence. Only they are applied to imaginary and variable objects. The dreamer is an actor who plays at will, the mad and the wise, executioner and victim, dwarf and giant, devil and angel. The Marquis Hervé, who is flatly contradicted by Maury, and whose essay I have been unable to obtain despite all my efforts, appears empathetically to protest against the underestimation of the psychic capacity in the dream. Maury speaks of him as follows.
Monsieur le Marquis Hervé, prêt à l'intelligence durant le sommeil toute sa liberté d'action et d'attention, et il ne semble faire consister le sommeil que dans l'occultation de sens, dans leur fermeture au monde extérieur, en sorte que l'homme qui dort ne se distingue guère, selon la manière de voir, de l'homme qui les éveille sa pensée en se bouchant le sens. Toute la différence qui séparait alors la pensée ordinaire de celle de dormir, c'est que, chez celui-ci, l'idée prend une forme visible, objective et ressemble à s'y même prendre à la sensation déterminée par l'objet extérieur. Le souvenir revêt l'apparence du fait présent.
The Marquis Hervé attributes to the intelligence during sleep all its freedom of action and attention, and he seems to make sleep consist only of the shutting of the senses, of their closing to the outside world. Except for his manner of seeing, the man asleep is hardly distinguishable from the man who allows his mind to wander while he obstructs his senses. The whole difference, then, between ordinary thought and that of the sleeper is that, with the latter, the idea takes an objective and visible shape, which resembles, to all appearances, sensations determined by exterior objects. Memory takes on the appearance of present fact. Maury adds, however,
qu'il y a une différence plus capitale à savoir que la faculté intellectuelle de l'homme endormi n'offre pas l'équilibre qu'elle se garde chez l'homme éveillé.
That there is a further and important difference in that the mental faculties of the sleeping man do not offer the equilibrium which they keep in the waking state. In Bachelt, who gives us fully information as to Hervé's book, we find that this author expresses himself as follows, in respect to the apparent incoherence of dreams.
L'image du réveil est la copie de l'idée. Le principal est l'idée. La vision n'est pas qu'à s'asseoir. Ceci établi, il faut savoir suivre la marche des idées, il faut savoir analyser le tissu des rêves. La incohérence devient alors compréhensible. La conception les plus fantastiques devient des faits simples et parfaitement logiques.
The image in a dream is a copy of an idea. The main thing is the idea. The vision is only accessory. This established, it is necessary to know how to follow the progression of ideas, how to analyze the texture of the dreams. Incoherence, then, is understandable. The most fantastic concepts become simple and perfectly logical facts.
Les rêves les plus bizarres trouvent même une explication des plus logiques quand on se les analyse.
Even the most bizarre dreams find a most logical explanation when one knows how to analyze them. J. Stekel has drawn attention to the fact that a similar solution of the incoherence of dreams was put forward in 1799 by an old writer, Wolf Davidson, who was unknown to me. The peculiar leaps of our imaginings in the dream state all have their cause in the laws of association, but this connection often occurs very obscurely in the soul, so that we frequently seem to observe a leap of imagination where none really exists. The evaluation of the dream as a psychic product in the literature of the subject varies over a very wide scale. It extends from the extreme of underestimation, as we have already seen, through premonitions that it may have a value as yet unrevealed, to an exaggerated overestimation, which sets the dream life far above the capacities of waking life. In a psychological characterization of dream life, Hildebrand, as we know, groups into three antinomies, and he combines in the third of these antinomies the two extreme points of this scale of values. In the contrast between, on the one hand, an enhancement, an increase of potentiality, which often amounts to virtuosity, and on the other hand, a decided diminution and enfeeblement of the psychic life, often to a subhuman level. As regards the first, who is there that cannot confirm from his own experience the fact that in the workings and weavings of the genius of dreams, there are sometimes exhibited a profundity and sincerity of emotion, a tenderness of feeling, a clearness of view, a subtlety of observation, and a readiness of wit, such as we should have modestly to deny that we always possessed in our waking life. Dreams have a wonderful poetry, an apposite allegory, an incomparable sense of humor, a delightful irony. They see the world in a light of peculiar idealization, and often intensify the effect of their phenomena by the most ingenious understanding of the reality underlying them. They show us as earthly beauty in a truly heavenly radiance, the sublime in its most supremest majesty, and that which we know to be terrible in its most frightful form, with the ridiculous being indescribably and drastically comical. And on waking, we are sometimes still so full of one of these impressions that it will occur to us that such things have never yet been offered to us by the real world. One might here ask oneself, do these depreciatory remarks and these enthusiastic praises really refer to the same phenomena? Have some writers overlooked the foolish and the others the profound and sensitive dreams? And if both kinds of dreams do occur, that is, dreams that merit both these judgments, does it not seem idle to seek a psychological characterization of the dream? Would it not suffice to state that everything is possible in dream, from the lowest degradation of the psychic life to its flight to heights unknown in the waking state? Convenient as such a solution might be, it has this against it, that behind the efforts of all the investigators of dreams, there seems to lurk the assumption that there is in dreams some characteristic which is universally valid in its essential features, and which must eliminate all these contradictions. It is unquestionably true that the mental capacities of dreams found readier and warmer recognition in the intellectual period now lying behind us, when philosophy rather than exact natural science ruled the most intelligent minds. Statements like that of Schubert, to the effect that dream frees the mind from the power of external nature, that it liberates the soul from the chains of sensory life, together with the similar opinions expressed by the younger Fichte and others who represent dreams as a soaring of the mind to a higher plane, all these seem hardly conceivable to us today. They are repeated at present only by mystics and devotees. With the advance of a scientific mode of thought, a reaction took place in the estimation of dreams. It is the medical writers who are most inclined to underrate the psychic activity in dreams as being insignificant and valueless, while philosophers and unprofessional observers, amateur psychologists, whose contributions to the subject in especial must not be overlooked, have for the most part, in the agreement with the popular belief, laid emphasis on the psychological value of dreams. Those who are inclined to underrate the psychic activity of dreams naturally show a preference for the somatic sources of excitation in the etiology of the dream. Those who admit the dreaming mind may retain greater part of its waking faculties naturally have no motive for denying the existence of autonomous stimulations. Among the superior accomplishments which one may be tempted, even on a sober comparison, to ascribe to the dream life, that of the memory is the most impressive. We have fully discussed the by no means rare experiences which prove this superiority. Another privilege of the dream life, often extolled by the older writers, namely the fact that it can overstep the limitations of time and space, is easily recognized as an illusion. This privilege, as Hildebrand remarks, is merely illusory. Dreams disregard time and space only as does waking thought, and only because dreaming is itself a form of thinking. Dreams are supposed to enjoy a further advantage in respect of time, to be independent of the passage of time in yet another sense. Dreams, like Maury's dream of his execution, seem to show that the perceptual content which the dream can compress into a very short space of time far exceeds that which can be mastered by our psychic activity in its waking thoughts. These conclusions have, however, been disputed. The essays of Le Laurent and Egger on the apparent duration of dreams give rise to a long, interesting discussion, which, in all probability, has not yet found the final explanation of this profound and delicate problem. The dreams are able to continue the intellectual activities of the day and to carry them to a point which could not be arrived at during the day, that they may resolve doubts and problems, and that they may be the source of fresh inspiration in poets and composers, seems, in the light of numerous records, and that of the collection of instances compiled by Chabanix, to be proved beyond question. But even though the facts may be beyond dispute, their interpretation is a subject to many doubts on wider grounds. Finally, the alleged divinatory power of the dream has become a subject of contention, in which almost insuperable objections are confronted by obstinate and reiterated assertions. It is, of course, right that we should refrain from denying that this view has any basis whatever in fact, since it is quite possible that a number of such cases may before long be explained on purely natural psychological grounds. End of section 6. Recording by Lambda.
Section 7 of the Interpretation of Dreams. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 7. The Ethical Sense in Dreams. For reasons which will be intelligible only after consideration of my own investigations of dreams, I have isolated from the psychology of the dream the subsidiary problem as to whether or to what extent the moral dispositions and feelings of waking life extend into dream life. The same contradictions which we were surprised to observe in the descriptions by various authors of all the other psychic activities will surprise us again here. Some writers flatly assert that dreams know nothing of moral obligations. Others as decidedly declare that the moral nature of man persists even in his dream life. Our ordinary experience of dreams seems to confirm beyond all doubt the correctness of the first assertion. Jessen says, "Nor does one become better or more virtuous during sleep. On the contrary, It seems that the conscious is silent in our dreams, inasmuch as one feels no compassion and can commit the worst of crimes, such as theft, murder, and homicide, with perfect indifference and without subsequent remorse. Radestock says, "It is to be noted that in dreams associations are affected and ideas combined without being in any way influenced by reflection, reason, aesthetic taste, and moral judgment. The judgment is extremely weak, and ethical indifference reigns supreme." Volquet expresses himself as follows: "As everyone knows, dreams are especially unbridled in sexual matters. Just as the dreamer himself is shameless in the extreme and wholly lacking in moral feeling and judgment, so likewise does he see others, even the most respected persons, doing things which, even in his thoughts, he would blush to associate them with in his waking state." Utterances like those of Schopenhauer, that in dreams every man acts and talks in complete accordance with his character, are in sharpest contradiction to those mentioned above. R. Fischer maintains that the subjective feelings and desires, or effects and passions, manifest themselves in the willfulness of the dream life, and that the moral characteristics of a man are mirrored in his dreams. Hafner says, "With rare exceptions, a virtuous man will be virtuous also in his dreams. He will resist temptation and will show no sympathy for hatred, envy, anger, and all other vices, whereas the sinful man will, as a rule, encounter in his dreams the images which he has before him in the waking state." Schultz says, "In dreams there is truth despite all camouflage of nobility or degradation, and we recognize our true selves. The honest man does not commit a dishonoring crime even in his dreams, or if he does, he is appalled by it as something foreign to his nature. The Roman emperor who ordered one of his subjects to be executed because he dreamed that he had cut off the emperor's head was not far wrong in justifying his action on the ground that he who has such dreams must have similar thoughts while awake. Significantly enough, we say of things that find no place even in our intimate thoughts, 'I would never even dream of such a thing.' Plato, on the other hand, considers that they are the best men who only dream the things which other men do." Plath, varying a familiar proverb, says, "Tell me your dreams for a time, and I will tell you what you are within." The little essay of Hildebrandt, from which I have already taken so many quotations, the best expressed and the most suggestive contribution to the literature of the dream problem which I hitherto discovered, takes for its central theme the problem of morality in dreams. For Hildebrandt, too, it is an established rule that the purer the life, the purer the dream, the impurer the life, the impurer the dream. The moral nature of man persists even in dreams. But while we are not offended or made suspicious by an arithmetic error, no matter how obvious, by a reversal of scientific fact, no matter how romantic, by an anachronism, no matter how ridiculous, we nevertheless do not lose sight of the difference between good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice. No matter how much of that which accompanies us during the day may vanish in our hours of sleep, Kant's categorical imperative dogs our steps as an inseparable companion, of whom we cannot rid ourselves even in our slumber. This can be explained only by the fact that the fundamental element of human nature, the moral essence, is too firmly fixed to be subjected to the kaleidoscopic